All right, are you ready? Ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to this 3-hour Azure workshop by Pragmatic Works. My name is Mitchell Pearson, and I'm excited to be with you for the next 3 hours in which we're going to dive into the world of Azure. What is Azure? And specifically, we're going to dive into talking about Azure Data Services. So let's jump over to our PowerPoint presentation and start the show. In this workshop, we're going to talk a lot about the different Azure services that are available. But before we do that, let's jump right in and talk just a little bit about myself and some of the highlights there. I am the training manager here at Pragmatic Works. I've been with Pragmatic Works for just over 8 years, almost 8.5 years now. And my role here at Pragmatic Works is delivering live training classes that we do, one-on-one mentoring with clients who call us up and need that kind of one-on-one assistance, and then building new classes for our on-demand learning platform, and of course doing free events like this as well. I've been very fortunate to author quite a few different books in the industry, a couple of them around Power BI, Power Platform, and one on Introduction to Microsoft SQL Server as well. And I blog at mitchellpearson.com, so if you haven't checked that out, please feel free to connect with me there. And then I also do a lot of YouTube videos, shorter videos that are not 3 hours in length, about 10 to 20 minutes. A lot of videos out there on Azure Data Factory. So if you want to follow me there, check me out at youtube.com/C Mitchell Pearson. That would be the short link. I also, whenever I'm not doing Power BI and Azure and all things business intelligence, I enjoy playing tabletop games with my friends and also with my family. So let's jump right in and take a look at the agenda for today. We're going to be taking a look at what is Azure. Before we can really dive into this, we need to have a little bit of a discussion around what is Azure, how does it help me, why do I want it, why do I use it. We're also going to dive into specifically Azure Storage, Azure SQL, what are my different options for Azure SQL, and then Data Factory. Data Factory is going to be a big piece of what we're talking about today, especially as we get into the second half of the day. And then if we have time, if time permits, and I hope we do, we'll see where we're at, we're going to take a look at 2 other features that I really want to highlight here, which is Azure Key Vault to keep your data secure and keep it protected, and then also Azure Synapse Analytics, which has just hit generally availability here in the last couple of weeks, and it's going to be a game changer for Azure. So I want to get just a real quick preview into that as well, if we have a moment to do that. Logistically speaking, there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. There will be a recording for this after this is done. So we're streaming this live right now, and as soon as we're done, this is going to be recorded and posted onto the Pragmatic Works YouTube channel. So it will be available. If you miss anything, if you have to step away, if you can't stay with us for the entire 3 hours, I totally understand. This will be available for your viewing pleasure afterwards. We will have a break around 10 to 15 minutes around that 12:25 Eastern time mark. So there will be a break in there. So if you're holding off to run, to grab something to drink or run to the bathroom, just hold on a little bit longer. We will have a break in there. And then we're going to have a lot of questions. We were looking at the attendees here. We have people who have joined us from all over the world. And Azure is such a huge platform that we know there's going to be a lot of questions as we're going through this. So we'll try to answer those questions when it makes the most sense to keep with the flow of this workshop, which will generally be probably after that first break. And then we'll try to do a follow-up blog on this as well to try to answer the most commonly asked questions as we're going through this. All right. So obviously one of the reasons we're doing this is because we here at Pragmatic Works have a huge training platform. Right now we have over 60 classes on Power BI, Power Apps, Azure, and SQL Server. And we're also going, fortunately, and having a huge sale right now, 65% off all of our on-demand learning classes here at Pragmatic Works. And so Brian, my coworker, is going to put that link in the chat window for you guys. So if you want to sign up right now and take a look and take advantage of that offer, please go ahead and do that. This is recorded, so there's going to be some people that are watching this in January, February, March of next year, and unfortunately that code is not going to be available. This is something that we're doing right now, and so there is that, so keep that in mind. Just to give you a quick glance at some of those classes that we have online, we have classes on Azure SQL Database, we have an intro and advanced class on Azure Data Factory, we have a course on Azure Logic Apps, a data science with Azure ML, analysis services in Azure, Databricks. So we have about 9 or 10 classes right now that are focused only on Azure, and that go very closely with the class that you're seeing here today. And then one last thing I want to mention before we jump into it. We have another one of these events coming at you in February where we're going to be talking about Power Apps. I don't get to work with Power Apps as much as I would like, but it's probably one of my favorite tools in the Power Platform because Power Apps are so cool what you can do with them. And so you definitely do not want to miss that presentation that's going to be coming on February 11th. And we have a sign-up link for that as well at pragmaticworks.com. All right, so that gets us through all of the introductions for today. We're going to jump right in and start talking about Microsoft Azure. So what is Microsoft Azure? We get that question a lot. Well, in just a quick snapshot here, Microsoft Azure is a cloud computing platform plus infrastructure for essentially building, testing, deploying, and managing your applications and services and your data. So historically speaking, and I say historically speaking, I haven't been in this industry 30 years, but if I even go back 10 years, 10 years ago, all the clients I were working with, we were doing everything on-prem. We had a server on-prem. We had database administrators, we had network professionals, we had infrastructure professionals that were responsible for buying the hardware, installing the hardware, patching the operating system, installing all the software, and keeping everything running smoothly. But over the last, 2008 I think is when Azure was introduced, but in the last probably 6 or 7 years, we've seen a huge transition to the cloud. And so what the cloud gives you is this ability to really focus on development. Building your applications, building your network, building your framework around your data, but you're allowing Microsoft professionals to manage your hardware, manage the infrastructure, keep your data secure, as well as keep backups of that data as well. And so Azure just gives us a lot of flexibility in that. And then we store that data in Microsoft data centers that are all over the world. Internationally, Microsoft has data centers all over the world. And so there's been tremendous growth in this area, and Azure is something that you hear more and more about in just everyday conversation. Now, Azure is pretty overwhelming. When you look at Microsoft Azure, there's over 22 different categories, and there are hundreds of services to choose from. So if you're jumping into Azure for the very first time and you're looking at it, it's a little bit intimidating. But one of the things that I found out coming from a SQL BI background on-prem is that Azure is actually easier in a lot of ways. And so once you get into it and you start provisioning resources and you see how quickly you can spin up an Azure SQL database, how quickly you can spin up a virtual machine, you start to realize, wait a minute, this is pretty awesome. There's a lot we can do here. But what we're going to do today is we're not going to focus on hundreds of services and we're not going to focus on 22 different service categories. We're going to focus on just Azure Data Services. Another thing that I want to mention is if you're brand new to Azure and you've never experienced this before, you can actually sign up for a free trial account and you get a lot of information with that. You can test and deploy enterprise apps for free. You can create custom mobile experiences. You can also go through kind of data analytics and gaining insight from your data. That comes with a $200 credit. So you're going to get about $200 credit from Microsoft for 30 days where you can go through and look at all of those different services. You're also going to get 12 months of popular free services, and then there's 25 services that are always free and always available for you to explore and have fun with. And I'll show you where that link is. We also have a link that we can drop right there in the chat window for you as well, so you can feel free to sign up for that. Today is not one of those classes where you're going to follow along with the demos that we do, but you can definitely sign up for that free trial, explore those different options, and come back and watch this video and maybe duplicate some of the work that we do in this video as well. So let's jump in and start focusing more on a more specific segment of Azure, which is going to be Azure Data Services. Before we jump into Azure, let's talk a little bit about on-prem environments, right? When you were managing an on-prem environment for your applications, for your data, for your different services, you were responsible for everything as an organization. You had to go out and procure the hardware, right? You had to buy the disk space, you had to buy your CPU, you had to install all of that and put it all together. You had to set up the network. Any virtualization that you wanted to do needed to be done. You had to install the operating system and keep it up to date. So anytime there was a new patch or a new update, you or somebody on your team had to take care of that. You then had to install all of your software and had to keep the latest version of that up to date, including what apps and how you managed all of your data. And there's a lot of work that goes into that when you're talking about an on-prem environment. And unfortunately, a lot of that, just being honest with you, as a consultant going to companies literally all over the world, I would see over and over again that a lot of that stuff did not get taken care of the way it was supposed to. But what if we could take that administration stuff and all of that hard work and the hardware and the infrastructure and just hand that off to somebody else and focus on just doing development, developing our apps and developing our data? Well, that's what we get when we start to transition over to Azure. And so the next thing that we have here is what's called infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service is where we give a little bit of that control over to Microsoft and their professionals, right? And we say, look, you manage the hardware, you manage the infrastructure, the storage, the servers, you do the virtualization for me. And now my team, we'll go ahead and take over the operating system, we'll keep it patched, we'll install the software that we want, we'll do the apps and the data, and we'll do all of that. So that's a big part of infrastructure as a service. And when you're going to Azure, you're really going to be choosing between two things. Most of the time it's going to be infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service for a lot of companies, there's their first attempt at kind of testing water with the cloud platform and giving over some of that control. But there's another level to this. And the next level to this is what's called platform as a service. Platform as a service, and you see in blue here, is where the vendor, in this case it's going to be Microsoft Azure, manages a lot more for you. So now they're not only managing the hardware and the infrastructure and the virtualization, they're now keeping your operating system patched and up to date. They manage your software. They keep all of that up to date for you. And now you're focused on just app development and data development. So you're focused much more on that piece. And then if your database crashes, guess what? They have a database ready to go. You can restore it instantly. If a data center goes down, you can have it set up to where you immediately fail over to another data center. And so you don't have to worry about if that's being done because Microsoft guarantees that it's being done in their service level agreement contracts that they sign with you. And then the last thing that we have here is software as a service. And software as a service is kind of like Office 365, Dynamics 365. That's your software as a service, and they pretty much do everything for you. You just insert data and read data, right? Write and read data from those platforms. So what we're going to be taking a look as we dive into the data services in Azure are these infrastructure as a service and then platform as a service solutions that we have available. Now in this diagram that I've created for you here, you're going to see on the left-hand side all of the different sources that you can potentially connect to. And you're going to have sources that are on-prem, coming from an on-prem environment, data sources that are coming from cloud environment, and then you're going to have structured data and unstructured data. And there's all these different data types that are out there. And so the problem that a lot of companies are facing right now today is they need a tool that will allow them to connect to these hybrid data sources on-prem, data sources in the cloud, but also all of these different types of data sources, and ingest that data, clean that data up, apply business rules and transformations to it, and then load it into kind of a curated data center, right? And so how do we do that today? Well, a lot of us come from that SSIS, enterprise BI background, and SSIS is no longer really built to do this because SSIS doesn't have a lot of cloud ETL capabilities. It can't connect to all of those new data sources that are coming out and all those new services in the cloud. And so the solution for that as you transition to Azure is most of the time going to be Azure Data Factory. If your background is SSIS, Azure Data Factory is almost a clone of it in Azure, where you have this nice graphical user interface experience. You can drag and drop, and you can perform those different activities. We also have another great tool for extracting and transforming data in something called Azure Databricks. That's another one of those classes we have, by the way, on our on-demand platform. Azure Databricks gives you a lot of flexibility and functionality there, where you can write in R, Python, Spark SQL, or Scala, and you have just a lot of flexibility. But in order to do those transformations in Databricks, it requires a lot of code. So the people who generally are going to be using your Azure Databricks are going to be your code-heavy data engineers and your data scientists because they're already familiar with it and that's what they're used to. And so for a lot of people, we're going to be doing Azure Data Factory, and for a lot of people, we're going to be doing Azure Databricks, depending on what you kind of gravitate to with what your experience is. And then we have Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, Azure Synapse Analytics is very interesting. I want to get to a quick preview of this at the very end, but Azure Synapse Analytics is essentially going to be a combination of both of those different ETL options that we currently have available. We got an interesting comment here from one of our attendees today. As a traditional DBA, this handover to Microsoft was very scary to me. I want to control my server, but after 2 years, I realized that I have more time to focus on improving stuff. And that's from Peter Smith, which I know Peter, so it's good to see you here, Peter, on the call today. And I'm going to talk about that as well. This is a really big point about what do I do now as a DBA, right? You've taken away all of my responsibilities. You focus on performance and improving app development. All right, and then once we've curated that data, we've cleaned it up, we've applied business rules and transforms, what do? Well, we're going to load that into some storage layer somewhere, ideally in the cloud. So we can dump that into Azure Data Lake, Blob Storage account, Azure SQL database. Maybe we're going to be doing big data analytics. We need that massive parallel processing, all right? We're going to take a look at SQL pools, formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And then we also have an option of using Azure Cosmos DB, which Cosmos DB is that non-relational way of storing data as well. And then, of course, you know that there's lots of other ways to store data in Azure as well, but these are kind of the main players that you see when you're moving there. And then if you want to report off of that data, how do you report? How do you connect to it? Well, we can just use Power BI. Power BI easily integrates with Azure because they're both built on the backbone of Azure. And then you see up in the top right corner there, I also have just an icon there for Azure Key Vault. Once again, that's a great way to keep your secrets and your passwords and information secure as you're working in Azure. All right, so these are the different data services that we have available. We're going to jump in now that we've kind of done a quick overview, and we're going to start talking about Azure Storage. So there's a couple of different storage options that are available in Azure, specifically Blob Storage or general purpose, and then Azure Data Lake. We'll get to that in just a moment. When you're working in Azure, we're going to take all of the different resources that we create and we're going to put all of those into something called a container, a logical container. And so resource groups are a great way of taking all of the different resources you're creating for a project or for a department or for something in that way, and you store all of them into a resource group. That resource group is very similar to like a directory location on your laptop or on your machine. And so we store all of that into that directory location. And the benefit of that is that you can deploy, update, and delete all of those resources as a group. In fact, in our Azure Data Factory course, the advanced course, we get into continuous integration and continuous development with Azure Data Factory, where how do we kind of build that enterprise level deployment, where we deploy from one environment to another environment. And we do that in part through resource groups and updating existing resource groups. And so that's a big part of Azure are these resource groups. But every resource that you provision, every resource that you create will be associated with a resource group. And that resource group is going to store all of your metadata information about the resources that you're creating, right? What type of resource is it? What's the name? What kind of resources are allocated to it, so on and so forth. And after this class is over today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the resource group that we create and I'm going to delete everything that's in that resource group as one operation so that I can make sure everything is removed essentially all at one point. So those are resource groups. And then when we start talking about Azure Storage and the options available, Azure Storage is really the general purpose account in Data Lake. This is kind of our cheapest option for storage that we have available in Azure. And so historically speaking, there's always been a lot of debate and conversation. Should I have a general purpose account or should I have a Data Lake? But as of Data Lake Gen 2, a lot of that debate has kind of gone away because what we recommend to people is if you're going to be creating a storage account in Azure, create it as an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 unless you need a couple of those features that are available in a general purpose account that don't exist in the Azure Data Lake. And there's a couple of them, but we're going to get to those here in just a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about parity or feature functionality, similarities between a general purpose account and an Azure Data Lake. Historically speaking, if you go back to Gen 1 Data Lake did not have hot and cold storage tiers. You also didn't have the ability to have really redundant storage. So you didn't have some really key elements. But some of the huge benefits of Data Lake is you have Azure Active Directory integration and it was Hadoop file system compatible. The biggest thing around Azure Active Directory is now you can apply with Data Lake security at the file level and at the folder, really at the folder level, whereas with general purpose accounts you cannot. And so there's a lot more flexibility around security with Azure Data Lake that you don't get with those general purpose accounts. And so once again, just to reiterate, we recommend that if you're starting this from scratch, building a proof of concept, you start with the Data Lake unless you need a general purpose account. When we look at storage security, we know that Azure Data Lake uses Azure Active Directory and it has that integration. Blob Storage account uses an access key, and that access key is a little bit dangerous because if somebody gets the name of your storage account and they get that access key, they can essentially get full access to your account. Now, the access key should be regenerated every 15 or 30 days on a schedule. But that's something to keep in mind. But with the Gen 2 accounts, we can use and take advantage of the login ID, that Azure Active Directory. There are some compliance things that we get with general purpose account that we don't get with Data Lake. We're not going to dive super deep into those today, but I want to mention them. One of those compliance things we see in finance a lot of times is what's called worm storage. Write once, read many. Once the data has been written, it cannot be modified, it cannot be changed, it is immutable. This is a big thing, once again, for a lot of companies that have to meet certain regulatory rules. Azure Blob Storage offers that capability of doing worm storage. Azure Data Lake does not. Azure Blob Storage offers the capability of doing soft delete. So if you accidentally delete a file through some erroneous process or through some malicious activity, what actually will happen there is you can restore that because it was a soft delete. Azure Data Lake currently doesn't offer that functionality. And so if you need those types of features, you might choose to go with Azure Blob Storage or the general purpose account, not in Azure Data Lake. But in most other scenarios, you're always going to go with Azure Data Lake here. So a little bit more about Azure Data Lake. It's designed specifically to store massive amounts of data for big data analytics. So once you store the data in your Azure Data Lake, you can retrieve that data in a number of different ways, right? So the compute that you use to do analytics on it can be HD Insight, Hadoop, Cloudera, Databricks. You can use Azure SQL Data Warehouse, which is now known as SQL Pools within Azure Synapse. But the compute that you use to connect to that data to return analytics can vary, but it's designed specifically for big data analytics. Key features here: unlimited scalability. It's compatible with Hadoop. You get support for access control list, once again giving us that kind of file structure that's in place and being able to apply permissions at that level. You get an optimized ADFS driver, and that is designed once again for big data analytics. And then of course we get that redundant storage. So you can have zone redundant and geo redundant so that if one data center goes down, you can immediately fail over to another data center and your data is there and your application is back up and running in no time, right? And so these are the key features of Azure Data Lake. There is a really awesome tool here that you might be interested in as well, and that is going to be Azure Storage Explorer. Azure Storage Explorer is a great way. It's an application that you can open on your Windows machine, your Mac OS, a Linux device. It works with both general purpose and Azure Data Lake. And once you open up this application, you can connect to your Azure account and you can see all of your different resources that are in Azure, whether it's a general purpose account or Data Lake. And you can interact. You can upload files, you can upload folders, you can change permissions, you can do some security stuff in there. So a lot of the stuff in the Azure service that you would do, you can also do in the Azure Storage Explorer. It's a great tool. I use it all the time. I would highly recommend downloading that and taking a look at that. All right. So what we're going to do is we're now going to jump over and take a look at the Azure portal, do a quick introduction just in case you've never seen it before. I'm going to talk about the navigation and kind of the ease of navigation, but there's a lot there. When you open up the Azure portal for the first time, it is absolutely without a doubt, it can be very intimidating. So we're going to open it up, we're going to explore the features, and then we're going to go ahead and create our first couple of resources here, a resource group, and then an Azure Storage account, specifically a data lake. All right, here we go. So we're going to jump back over, and I've already opened up a web browser here, but what I'll do is I'm going to open up a new web browser, and we're going to go to azure.com. And when I go over to azure.com, what it's going to do there is it's going to redirect us to, en/US, right? So English US. And now I'm sitting at azure.microsoft.com. And there is a lot of information here. There is a wealth of knowledge that Microsoft has put out. One of my favorite sections on this entire website here is going to be the documentation page. This gives you a lot of great information about all of the different services. So yes, when you're looking at Azure, there are hundreds of services, but Microsoft has documentation on all of them. And it gives you a foundation. It gives you the fundamentals of what does this service do? How do I work with that service? The other thing that I'm going to show you here is where you would go if you wanted to sign up for a trial account. So all the way over on the right, you'll see this little green option right here in green text that says create a free account. That gives you $200 in Azure credit for 30 days with 25 plus free services that are always available to you. And so if you haven't done this yet, if your company hasn't quite made that migration, this is a great way of just getting in there, exploring it, and starting to learn Azure for yourself. Once you've gone through this and you've created your account, you've looked through the documentation, you have an idea of what you want to do, What do we do next? Well, we're going to sign in to the Azure portal. And so normally you would see right here a sign in option. Well, I'm already signed in, so I'm just going to click on the portal, and that actually will take me directly into the Azure portal where I can start developing resources. So I'm going to click right there at the very top, and that is going to open up my Azure account. So it'll make me choose which subscription I want to use here. And this is what I see when I first log in. This right here is my home page. You can choose in your settings whether you want to be in your home page or whether you want to be in a dashboard here. But let's kind of walk through real quick the navigation and get you familiar with that. Over here on the left-hand side, we have our navigation pane. I can collapse that pane and I can expand that pane to kind of get it out of the way. In the settings, in just a moment, you're going to see there's some other stuff you can do with this. In the first section here, right here at the top, you will spend a lot of time right here in this section. So for example, if you wanted to create a brand new resource in Azure, you wanted to create a storage account, a SQL database, you wanted to create a data factory so you could start building pipelines and moving data, you would go to create a resource, you would search for the resource that you want to create, and you could walk through those steps. And we're going to create quite a few of those resources as we work through this workshop today. You can also go to your home screen, and as I mentioned before, I am currently on my home screen. So this shows me some common Azure services, and it also shows me my recent resources that I've been working with in Azure. Down here on the bottom, you have your favorite section. Now my favorite section is going to be different than your favorite section, and your favorite section is going to be different than everybody else's. Because what you do in Azure is you're going to take the services that you work with the most, and you're going to add them into that favorites pane. In fact, if I hover over resource groups right here and I freeze the screen, you'll notice I can click on that little star icon right there, and that will add it to my favorites, or I can remove it from my favorites. You can also do a little bit of drag and drop here where you take these items and you move them around. So if I want resource groups to fall a little bit lower on that list, I can just drag it up or drag it down and move it up and down on that list. All right? And now it's trying to move everything at one time. There we go. All right, so that's how you kind of work with the favorites here, but you'll get very familiar with that when you're working in Azure. That's a very common thing. The other thing I want to show you is just some basic fundamental settings here across the top. So this tells me immediately which account I'm logged into. And as you're working with Azure, it's very common to have multiple subscriptions and multiple logins. So you might be in the wrong account, but that's my account that I'm currently logged in. If you want to provide feedback to the Microsoft team and tell them how great they're doing, you can do that right here, right? Are you satisfied? If you are, you tell them you are. Give them some kudos there, pat them on the back, or you can tell them if something isn't quite working the way you would expect and give them that feedback. You'll also notice right here under question mark, there's a lot of support here that you can look at. You can take a look at what's new in Azure. You can take a look at Azure updates. They also have a guided tour that you can launch that'll kind of walk you through the interface and get you more familiar with it. And then there's keyboard shortcuts as well. The help and support section up here at the top will take you to all of that documentation that we talked about and also give you the opportunity to support or submit a support ticket to Microsoft, right? The other thing I want to dive into is the portal settings. Now, your experience might actually look a little bit different than mine, and that might be because you've changed your settings, or maybe I've changed my settings from the default when I first logged in myself. And so under settings right here, you'll notice that you can set up how long are you active before you get signed out. You can also set up your default view. Do you land on a home page like mine is here, or do you land on a specific dashboard that you've created? And so one of the things you can do in Azure is you can create dashboards. And we won't get into dashboards today, but those dashboards that you create, you can set up things like service health and what kind of resources it's using, if it's running, if it's paused, and that can be a big deal as far as saving you money, right? And so if you've created a dashboard that you want to make sure is the first thing you see every time you log into Azure, then you can click on that right there. You'll also notice that that navigation pane I was showing you a moment ago, that portal menu, mine is docked, but you can change that to fly out here. And when you change it to fly out, and this is what a lot of people, from experience, theirs looks like this, is you can now just completely hide that menu. So you come up here, you click on what you want, but whenever you click away, it goes away. And it just gives you more real estate to work with when you're working in Azure. And so that's totally up to you. I personally prefer just leaving mine docked. That way it's always available when I want it, and I can minimize it when I want to get rid of it. And then the final thing here, which is really cool, is you can change your theme when you're working in Azure. So I can change that to a dark theme. If I want to see a dark theme here, we can do that. You can change it to different themes. You can change the contrast level. So there's a lot of options that we have available when we're working right here in the settings of Azure. And that's how you get to that right there. All right, you'll also have your notifications pane right here. That'll be the last thing I talk about. This will tell you when you're provisioning resources, if they're still under the provisioning process, if they've completed, or any other notifications that are kind of popping up as you're working in Azure, they'll show up right there in that section. All right, so we've gone through an introduction to Azure. We've walked through the portal. Most of you are probably familiar with that. Some of you are probably brand new. What are we going to do now? I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of resources. Once again, do not feel obligated by any means to follow along. We have a lot of demos today. There's no way I could fit everything in and have everybody follow along. But I'm going to create a resource group, and then we're going to create a data lake account. We'll upload a file to that data lake account just to see what that looks like. We'll take a look at it with Storage Explorer. So that's going to be our next section. Let's jump right in and take a look at how we do that. Whenever I want to create a resource in Azure, let me point out that you can create a resource in a number of different ways. You can create it through PowerShell, you can create it through ARM templates, which are automated kind of Azure resource scripts that you create, or you can just do it right here in the UI. For simplicity's sake, we're going to do everything that we do today through the UI, but keep in mind that there are ways to automate this and to set this up through code. So what I'm going to do is up here in the very top left, in that navigation pane, I'm going to go back over here and click on Create a Resource. And when I click on Create a Resource, this brings us to the marketplace. Right here, we can see those 22 different categories and those hundreds of different services that are available in Azure. Once again, this can be pretty overwhelming. What I'm going to do is I'm going to search for a resource group. And this is me assuming that we haven't quite created a resource group yet for this project or for this webinar that we're doing. And so I'll search the marketplace for a resource group. Anything that kind of matches that search criteria will show up. And then what we want is this option right here. So this resource group option right here is what I'm going to do. And I could, hit the like button right there if I want to, and then we can hit create. So let's go ahead and click on that resource group. And this view that you're seeing right here, this is the view that you're going to get and you're going to see every time you pretty much create a resource through the UI in the Azure portal. You're going to see this screen that pops up. It tells you what the resource is you're creating. You have a create button, and then down here at the bottom, it gives you an overview of that service. It tells you the plans, and then it also gives you usage information and support. Very, very helpful stuff. But we're going to dive right in here and click create. And what that's going to do is bring us to the resource creation page. Now, this is where it can get very intimidating because there's a lot of options that are available on this screen. However, you don't have to worry about all those options when you're first getting started with Azure. Most of the time, you can give it a couple of parameters, a couple of properties, and you're good to go. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to give our resource group a name. We're going to choose the location where it's going to be stored, and that's it. So the name that we're going to use here is going to be, and I've already got a backup set up, so I'm going to have to give this a little bit of a variation from what I already created earlier in case we ran out of time or had some internet connectivity issues. But I'm going to create one called Azure Workshop. And since this is going to be our Learning with the Nerd events, I'll add that on to the end. So Learning with the Nerds. And then we'll just say, I'll put my initials on the end. And then I need to choose my region. So choosing the region and the location is actually very important for latency's sake, for productivity and performance, but also for cost. We'll talk a little bit more about that cost as we dive into this. But I'm going to grab the East US 2 right there. And then that's going to be it. So once you've done that, down here at the bottom, I can go to Review and Create, and we can create that resource. You will notice across the top, there's a couple of other categories here like tags and Review and Create. Just real quick, tags are going to be a way of helping to understand pricing and billing. So what project was that resource associated with? Who was the owner? Who purchased it? So they're very, very helpful, but you don't need them immediately right out of the gate. And so we're not going to worry about that for today. And then we're going to go down and do Review and Create. So as this is going through the creation process, one thing worth mentioning here is I want to keep all of my resources in the same region, ideally for reducing cost. Because if you move data from one region to another, there's actually an egress charge associated with that for moving data. And so there is a cost with that. So that's why when you're creating your storage accounts, you're creating your databases, you're creating your data factory, and you're moving data, if you can keep it all in the same region, you definitely want to do that and keep it in that same data center there. All right, so what we're going to do next is we should have that resource group created, and you see that it is created right here. And then from there, I'm going to go over to my resource groups. Now, how do we get to that resource group? Well, a quick way of getting there is you can just click on right here, go to resource group from your notifications. But I can also go over here to the very left, and I'm going to teach you this navigation here, and I'm just going to click on resource groups from my favorite section. So I'll click right there, and that's going to open up our resource groups here. And then I'm going to find the resource group that we just created here called Azure Workshop, Learning with the Nerds, and then my initials right there on the end, and I'll open that up. Now, I won't go through this for every resource that we create, but you'll notice that every resource you create essentially looks kind of the same. When you open it up right here, what just happened is Microsoft opened up something called a blade. It's like this vertical pane that opens up, and so they open up kind of horizontally across your screen. So when I click on that resource group there, we get this vertical pane that opens up. This is what's called a blade in Azure. And if you keep clicking on new tabs, it'll keep opening up these vertical tabs, which get a little bit frustrating to navigate when you're brand new to Azure because it's a new experience. But down here across the bottom, I can grab the scroll bar if I had a scroll bar, and you can move back across those blades. Or up here in the top left, you can close that out and you can kind of go back to the previous blade as well. The other thing that I want to point out is we are currently looking at this resource right here called Azure Workshop, Learning with the Nerds LP, and you'll notice just below that it tells you what kind of resource you're currently in. So this is a resource group. And directly below that, I have all of the different administrative properties that I can set up right here. And there's things like resource cost, events, access control, who has control to this. You can look at deployment history, properties, all of that kind of stuff. And so different resources will have different properties that you can control, but you don't need to know all of this when you first get started with Azure. All right? So what we want to do is we've created a resource group. This is just a logical container. I now want to go ahead and create a Azure Data Lake. So let's go create an Azure Data Lake, and I'm going to go ahead and expand our navigation pane over here on the left. We're going to click on Create a Resource, and I'm going to search for not Azure Data Lake. This is tricky. We're actually going to search for Storage Account. So the way that you create a general purpose storage account or an Azure Data Lake in Azure is going to be through the same service. So we'll search for Storage Account. It looks just like this. And this storage account that we're about to create will create for us either a general purpose account or a data lake based on one button that we click. So now I'm going to go ahead and click Create. You'll see the screen right there looked identical to what it looked like for the resource group. And now we have all of these options across the top. Once again, very, very intimidating when you're brand new. But you don't need to set all of that up, especially not from the very beginning. You don't need to know. And most of those properties that you see across the top, we can actually set these up and configure these after the fact. So after you've provisioned that resource, after you've created it, you can go in there and you can set those up. So the first thing that we want to do here is we want to go ahead and select our resource group. And the resource group that we're going to be using is the one that we just created called Azure Workshop Learn with the Nerds, and then my initials. So we'll click on that right there. And then we need to give this a storage account name. Now there's a couple of requirements here around the storage account name. One, it must be all lowercase characters. Two, it has to be globally unique across all of Azure, because when you create a storage account, the way that you connect to that is actually through the name itself. And so for the storage account here, we're going to do Azure Workshop Learning with the Nerds, and then I'll put my initials on the end of this one as well. Once again, I want the resource group or the location of this resource to match my resource group and my other one. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with and stay with the East US 2. And then down here at the bottom, you'll notice that we are currently creating a general purpose V2 account. This is not where we change this to either general purpose or data lake. This is where we just say, hey, we want V2. I'll show you where we change this to data lake here in just a moment. The next thing that we do have to decide is what type of redundant storage do we want? And so the cheapest option here, and the one that's going to be built in, is what's called local redundant storage. And the way that Microsoft works is when you're working with your data lake or your storage account, it's going to keep 3 copies of that data at any given time. So if in a data center, if a data rack goes down, you have at least 2 other copies of your data on other data racks. This is one of the huge benefits of Azure, is you have that kind of fail-safe built in, whereas if you were on-prem and your server crashed, what happens? Your server's down. You got to go build a new server, provision the hardware, install everything, or get the existing one fixed. With Azure, you're back up and running in seconds. Now, if that entire data center goes down, somebody is doing some construction, they cut the lines to that data center, then you're not going to have any data if you're doing local redundant storage, because that's redundancy within that data center. And as you'll see, when you click the drop down here, there's lots of other options. So you can have redundancy within that zone, that geographical zone, more than 60 miles apart. You can have geographical redundancy, and there's some other options. As you move up and you get additional redundancy, it does have a cost associated with it. So that's something that you have to consider as well. For this example, I'm going to go with the cheapest option possible, and we're going to go with local redundant storage. All right. The next thing that we're going to do is you'll see across the top we can go into networking. This is where you can control access through IP addresses. You have data protection. Under data protection, you can do things like soft delete for blobs. So if somebody deletes a file accidentally, you can recover those files. You can do versioning for your blob, so you can roll back to a previous version. You can also turn on a point-in-time restore for your container. So if a folder gets deleted, you can restore that entire folder, or you can essentially roll back to a previous version if bad data gets written to that folder. We're not going to mess with any of that for now, but what we are going to do is we're going to go to the Advanced tab, and there's one thing that I want to do on the Advanced tab. There's lots of options in here, but what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in, and right here where you see hierarchical namespace, I am going to enable that. This is the one button that you click in Azure when you're creating your storage account to signify that this is going to be a data lake. And you must select this at the time when you create that resource. So you can't go back in and modify this after the fact. Excuse me. Once you create this as a storage account or as a data lake, it's going to be that. That's what it is. So we're going to actually change this real quick, and I'm going to turn on this to turn it into a data lake. And then with that being done, I'm going to go back to the previous page, and you'll notice on the previous page that a lot of those options that were there under data protection are now disabled. And so this is one of those things about Azure Data Lake. You lose that point-in-time restore. You lose the ability to do soft deletes. You lose that versioning for blobs. And you also lose that other thing we talked about in the slides with that worm storage for those financial companies that have those regulatory requirements. Once you write the data, it cannot be messed with. It cannot be played with. That's what you get, right? And so there are those limitations with Azure Data Lake. And so if you need these options, then you have to go back and do Blob Storage account. Now here's the thing. If I go and look at my Azure subscription and I look at all my different projects that I've created, I have lots of Blob Storage accounts. I have lots of data lakes. So you're not tied to one data lake or one Blob Storage account. So if you have some data that requires that regulatory compliance with worm storage and you're worried about an application accidentally deleting files and you want to be able to use that soft delete functionality, then for that project, for that application, maybe you go with a Blob Storage account. But for everything else, you go with your data lake that gives you that kind of heightened level of security, right? So you're not tied to one or the other. You can always have a hybrid of different services in Azure. That's just a great part of that flexibility. All right, so we could go into advanced and talk about all those different features, but once again, you don't need to know all that for this 3-hour webinar, and you don't even need to know that to get started with Azure. You can just get in here and jump in and get started. And then under tags, once again, I could come in here and type in something like project. And I could say this project is the Azure Workshop. And so then when I get my billing information, this resource is now tagged for that. And I can see exactly what my costs are. And so it's definitely a best practice to add tags to all your resources. We're just not worried about that today. So once we've gone through all that, we click Review and Create. And it brings us right here where we can review our resource. And then once you review everything, make sure that everything is set up the way you want it, we're going to click on Create. Now here's the thing. So far, let's talk a little bit about price. The resource group that we've created cost us $0, cost us no money. The storage account that we just created is not costing us anything right now. The way that you get billed for storage accounts is you get billed for writing data to the storage account and reading data from it. So if I build the storage account and I don't put anything in it and I'm not working with it, or I'm only working with it a very small amount of the time with a small amount of files, it's going to be pennies on the dollar. It's going to be very minimal cost associated with that. And you can monitor that cost over time inside of Azure and see what that looks like. But so far, I haven't created anything that's actually costing me any money. Now, the storage account has been created. We got a pop-up notification. It's telling me right here on the screen that I can go directly to that resource. I could, but I want to show you the navigation, right? So what I'll do is go to Resource Groups over here on the left, right there in my favorites, and I'll click on that. I'm then going to find the resource group that we created in this class called Azure Workshop Learn with the Nerds, Mitchell Pearson, and I'll click on that. And then as I start creating resources and associating them with this resource group, they will all show up right here in this screen. And so now what we're going to do is let's go take a look at what this storage account looks like. As I click on that, Azure is going to open up a new blade over to the right. It's going to open up a new vertical blade. So let's go ahead and click on that real quick right there. And then in here, once again, we get all of these different properties here that we can take a look at. And these are going to be the properties for that storage account. Down here across the bottom, you see we have this horizontal bar. I can go back to any of the previous blades. So this takes me back to my resource group, and this takes me back to all of my resources. So this is a little bit tricky to get used to at first, but definitely something that is important. All right, and so now I'm going to go over here and click on Containers. And under Containers, what we want to do is anytime you're uploading files or you are removing files from your Azure Storage account, you have to put that into a container essentially. So we need to create a container. And I'm going to go ahead in this Azure Data Lake, I'm going to create a new container here, and I'm just simply going to give it a name. So let's find the mouse there. I think I lost it. Let's see if we can find it. I have lost the mouse. I see it on the screen there, but it's not on my screen. All right, so I'll do it like this. Here we go. That's weird. All right. So we're going to zoom in. We'll give this container a name. I'm just going to call this one Employees. It does have to be all lowercase. It's just a directory location that we are building. And so I'll create that. I'm going to leave it with private access here. And there's my mouse. It came back. And I'll click Create. It was on the recording screen, but it wasn't on my screen, which was a little bit confusing. And once you create that container, we can now upload files, download files, and we can work with that. Now, a lot of times you're going to be doing this through an automated process. You'll be doing this through an application that you've developed. You'll be doing this from Azure Data Factory. For this demo, I just want to show you some quick interaction. We're going to take a file that we have, and we're going to upload that to the container just so you can say, hey, I've never worked with Azure before. Is it really that easy? How do I get data into Azure? Well, we've just created a storage account in a couple of minutes here. We click on Employees. And when I go into that folder, I can now click right here at the top, and I can upload files directly to this storage account. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll click on Upload here. It opens up a new pane over here on the right. I'll click on the little Browse button right there, and then I'm going to go over to my C drive. And under the Azure Workshop right here, I have a file in there called Employees. I'm going to grab the employee file, and I'm going to upload that to my storage account. So I'll click on Open. Click on Upload, and there we go. Instantly that file exists in Azure, and it is now stored in a Microsoft Data Center. All right, so that right there is going to be our employee file. And remember that any files that we upload to our storage account, we have to upload those to a container. And those containers are essentially, just think about them like you would think about your on-prem environment when you open up File Explorer. Those containers are kind of like the directory location or the folder where you're storing your files. And so the interesting thing about containers is that you can have access policies and security that you set at different container levels so that one group of developers or one group of users have access to one container, but they don't have access to another one. And so they're great for logically grouping files together, but also for managing security there as well. And so that's what we get with our containers. Now, we have a file. How do we take a look at this file and make sure that it uploaded it correctly? It's now stored in a Microsoft Data Center in the East US region. Well, what I can do is actually click on that file right there, and that opens up this new screen, once again, a new blade in Azure. And then up here across the top, I am going to tell it that I want to click on Edit, and I can actually look at the file and edit it live right here. So I'm going to click on Edit, and then we see that we have a very simple file with the text qualifiers there, the pipe delimiter separating the first name from the last name column. And that is a file in Azure. Now, the other thing I want to show you real quick is that there's other ways to interact with this. So maybe you're like, look, I want to upload files, but I don't want to know anything about Azure. Azure's a lot. There's a lot of navigation in there. Is there an easier way to do this? Well, yes, there is. There's an application that you can use called Azure Storage Explorer. And Azure Storage Explorer is great for uploading data, downloading files, also setting up stuff like security and properties on your storage account. So if I go back over here, I actually have already opened up Azure Storage Explorer on my machine. Over here on the left, I'm currently in the Explorer view. The Explorer view allows me to go through and look at all of the different storage accounts. But first, you would need to sign in to an Azure account. And so you can see right here that I am currently signed in as mitchelljax2003@outlook.com. That is our Azure sponsorship. And then I am currently only displaying storage accounts from that subscription, right? So then when I go back over to the Explorer right here, I can expand this option right here and I can see all of my storage accounts. And you'll notice that I have ADLS Gen 2, so that is my Azure Data Lake Gen 2 account. I have my regular, just general purpose storage accounts in here. And then I also have some very plain and ordinary blob storage accounts. So what I want to do is let's find that storage account that we just created called Azure Storage. It was Azure Workshop, with my initial on the end. Let's go ahead and refresh everything here. I didn't refresh, that was my problem. I already had it logged in. So we're going to go ahead and find our Azure Storage account under my Microsoft sponsorship right here. There it is, Azure Workshop, Learn with the Nerds MP. I will expand that option for that storage account, expand the blob containers, and then we have this container for employees and all of our employee files, and then we see the file right there. Now, if you want to upload files here, never log into the Azure portal, you can do that. So I can come in here and say I want to upload. I can upload an entire folder with tons of files, thousands of files if I want, or I could select, just like we did in the Azure portal, I can hand select exactly which files we want to upload to the Azure portal. And we can do that right there. You can also grab a folder and you can download it. And then there's a ton of other things that you can do in Storage Explorer. Once again, we could spend an entire 3 hours on Storage Explorer because it has really great capabilities. But from a usability perspective, you can do all of your interaction with an Azure Data Lake or your storage account without ever logging into the Azure portal once it has been created, because you can upload and download and do all of your interaction right here. Now, ideally, we're going to automate all that. We're going to automate it through Data Factory. We're going to automate it through line of business applications that are writing the files and doing all that work. But if you need to do some manual operations, you can do it right here. All right, so in this section right here, what we did is we created a resource group, we created a storage account, we uploaded a file to that storage account, we made sure that it worked exactly the way we expected it to, and then we also took just a real quick glance here at Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer. And this gets us started, but we want to get into some more exciting stuff. So we're going to move into a section now where we start talking about Azure SQL. What are the different options available for Azure SQL? And then when we come back from that break, we're going to dive into the world of Data Factory and how do we now start moving data between all of our different services, cleaning that data up, ingesting it, and applying business transformations. So what I'm going to do is we're going to jump back over to our PowerPoint presentation, and we're going to take a look at Azure SQL Database. Now, Azure SQL Database is a managed version of SQL that is in Azure. And so Microsoft is managing the database, they're managing the backend, the infrastructure, they manage your backups, they do everything for you. And we're going to dive deeper into that. But it's not the only option that is available when you're starting to move to Azure. What a lot of people do, right, if you're working with SQL Server specifically, is currently today a lot of people are still working with that on-prem. They have an on-prem environment, they've provisioned a server, they have their own database administrators, and they're doing all of that work on-prem. And a lot of companies, they'll start to make that migration to Azure and they'll go with infrastructure as a service. So you're still responsible for kind of patching your operating system. You're still responsible for updating your software. And so you might do something like go with SQL Server on a virtual machine. This is going to be a very cost-effective manner. It's very cost-effective. It's not nearly as expensive as some of the other options that are out there. And you get very, very close to 100% feature functionality with on-prem SQL Server. So if you have SQL Server on-prem, you want to keep every piece of feature functionality that you got, you move it all to a virtual machine and you have everything there. You can also go with something called Azure SQL Database. We can spin up an Azure SQL Database here in less than a couple of minutes, and we can pay as little as $5 a month to build a proof of concept. So we can have an Azure SQL Database hosted at a Microsoft managed data center that is up and running. It has data in it. We can query the data. We can write to the database for as little as $5 a month. How awesome is that? And we don't have to spin up a server. We don't have to provision anything. Everything is done for us. But Azure SQL Database does have some limitations that doesn't give you all of the functionality that you might get when you're working with SQL Server on-prem. And so then what do? You're like, look, I don't want a VM because a VM, I have to do all the management, all the backups, all the patching. That's just too much work. We need to get out of that world. We just want to focus on development. But we go with Azure SQL Database, and there's some limitations there where I don't get everything that I get with SQL Server on-prem. Well, the next option here is another platform as a service, just like Azure SQL Database. So everything is managed for you. That's going to be what's called SQL Managed Instance. And this is where you have SQL Database running on a virtual machine, but you get a lot of that server level functionality that you lose with Azure SQL Database. We'll talk about those limitations here in just a moment. Another option for SQL, and this is really when you're doing big data analytics and data science and machine learning and you just need really powerful resources. Another option that's going to be available to us is what's called SQL Pools, formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Azure SQL Data Warehouse is a massive parallel processing service. And this really shows the power. Let me stop for just a moment and give you an example of the power of Azure. If I go back about 5 or 6 years, we used to do a lot of consulting business around going to companies and installing these SQL data warehouses for them. And for somebody to get started with that on-prem, they would have to spend a minimum of $250,000 to procure the hardware. And then they would pay a company like Pragmatic to come in and essentially set everything up for them. And so that might cost them a lot more money on top of that. And so the barrier to entry here, your entry point to using a massive parallel processing platform, might cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to get started. And you wouldn't even know if it's going to work until after you got everything set up and configured. With Azure, in just a few moments, in a few minutes, we can go out there and spin up an Azure SQL Data Warehouse, massive parallel processing. We can do that in a few minutes. We can pay a few dollars. We can run some tests, see if it works. And if it does, great, we move forward. If it doesn't, we burn it to the ground. No harm, no foul. That is such an incredible feature that we get with Azure that we just couldn't do when we were working on-prem, right? And so that is another one of those SQL options that you have available to you. This is a huge push by Microsoft right now. They've made a ton of improvements to SQL pools and some of that functionality in the release with Azure Synapse. And so that is another SQL option that we have available. We're going to be focused specifically on Azure SQL Database in this class, but just know that there are other options that are available to you. Now, what is Azure SQL Database? It is a platform as a service. What does that mean? Microsoft is managing the hardware, the infrastructure, all of your backups, your data redundancy, patching your operating system. All of the hard work, Microsoft is doing that for you. And then your responsibility is building your database, building your tables, loading the data into that, right? Writing and reading data from it. So you still have the flexibility. Unlike a software as a service like Dynamics or Office 365, you still build your databases, you build all your tables, you build all your programmability, but you get to focus. And Peter said this earlier in his comment to us, right? You get to essentially focus on the development and performance tuning instead of having to develop with or worry about all of that other administrative stuff that's going on in the background. So that's what Azure SQL Database is. It is a relational database as a service. I know there's a big push right now, especially among app developers, for kind of non-relational databases. But Azure SQL Database is your traditional relational database as a service, near zero administration, right? Because Microsoft is doing the scaling for you, the backups, the disaster recovery, patching your operating system, patching your software. You also get a pretty awesome financially backed service level agreement from Microsoft. Microsoft essentially guarantees you that 99.99% of the time, your Azure SQL database is going to be up and running, and it's always going to be running. And if it goes down, they will financially back that agreement. So on your next billing statement from Microsoft, you will see a line item there where they are crediting you money if it went down for a length of time. You don't have to fight them for it. They just give that to you. And so Microsoft is very financially motivated to make sure that happens for you. It obviously accelerates development cycles for all the reasons we talked about before. You don't have to go out and buy all the hardware, install all the components, set everything up. I have been at clients where a server crashed and it was a fire sale, right? It took everything we could do to get another server provisioned and everything set up. And it was not a minute process or an hour process. Sometimes it would take an entire day because we had to get all of that stuff set up. But with, in Azure, if something goes wrong, Microsoft has you covered. You just fell over to another copy of that database. But if you want to spin something up real quick from a development perspective, we can do this in just a couple minutes, which we'll do here in just a second. The other great thing of Azure is you only pay for what you need. If you are purchasing a car, you have to go out there and buy the entire car, and then you're stuck with it unless you can sell it to somebody else. But if you can go out there and just hire an Uber or a Lyft, then you only use what you need, you pay them for that, and then you're done. And in a lot of ways, Azure SQL Database is kind of like that, right? Predictable price performance. You know exactly what you're paying. The Azure SQL Database that we're going to provision here costs me $5 per month. I know what the price is, and I know what performance level I'm going to choose. And then the other benefit of Azure SQL Database is we get a very familiar SQL environment and tooling, which means we're going to be able to use things like SQL Server Management Studio for that. And so those are just kind of benefits with Azure SQL Database. Another thing that's worth mentioning here is you do get 3 built-in replicas. So you get 3 built-in copies of your data for high availability. One of the awesome things, I cannot stress this enough, is that you actually get point-in-time restore capability with Azure SQL Database out of the box. So Microsoft is constantly taking backups of your database. And if you ever need to back or restore to a very specific point, maybe you had an application that inserted some bad data, something went wrong with one of your processes, you can immediately go in there and do a point-in-time restore back to a very specific point. The default functionality that's built in allows you to go back about 35 days. So up to 35 days, point-in-time restore, you don't have to set any of that up. It is awesome. Geo-replication, you can have your data replicated to multiple geographical regions. So just like we were talking about with storage accounts, if an entire data center goes down and you have all of your applications, whether they're line of business applications or web applications, feeding to that database and it has to be up and running, you can flip over to another geographical region and you can start using your database there. So minimal downtime if you've set this up correctly. The other huge benefit is that anytime you delete a database in Azure, they automatically take a backup of that database. They automatically do it. So if you accidentally delete a database in production, and we all know that that happens more than we would like to admit, you can actually restore that database. I was actually doing an Azure boot camp about 3 weeks ago, and one of my students said that they were in production and accidentally deleted a database. Fortunately for them, it was in Azure, and so the administrator came along, restored the database, no harm, no foul. But yeah, that's an awesome thing with Azure. You also get security, things like transparent data encryption, TDE, which means your data at rest is always secure and it's always protected. So if by some chance somebody was able to break into a Microsoft data center, steal the hard drive and run out of there, your data is still encrypted, it's still protected. You get role level security and your data is always encrypted. You also get kind of advanced threat detection with Azure Defender for SQL. So this monitors things like login activity and who's trying to authenticate to your SQL server and can set it up to where it sends you alerts and keeps you up to date as far as any kind of malicious intent there. Automatic database tuning that you get in SQL Server is there. And then, of course, we get the Azure Active Directory integration. So all of these great features that you see are built into Azure SQL Database out of the box, near zero administration for you. All right, so these are really great features here. And this is just a small part of Azure SQL Database. I think our course on this is like 7 or 8 hours long, and we go into all these different features. But I just want to show you, like, why would I maybe want to move to Azure SQL Database? What are the features? What is the functionality? And all of the things that you see here are part of that, right? All right, so that's Azure SQL Database. There are some limitations with SQL Database, and that's when you run into these limitations and you start to ask yourself, okay, maybe I need to do VM, or maybe I want all of that managed capability that you were just telling me about, but I can't use SQL Database, so maybe we take a look at managed instance, right? What are some of the limitations? Well, you're not going to be able to work with .bak files, right? You're not going to do your, historically speaking, we used to take backups of our databases and restore them. You don't have to do any of that anymore, so Microsoft essentially removed that capability. There's no more window authentication. We're now doing everything through Azure Active Directory. There's no change data capture. That's not a feature available. SQL Agent, and then you see the other options that are on the screen. The one thing about SQL Database is that it was designed in such a way that you create your Azure SQL Database as an individual database. It's not something that is stored on a physical server like when you do this on-prem. It is something that is stored as an individual database. And because it's an individual database, there is a lot of server-level functionality that you lose from an on-prem environment. And that's why SQL Managed Instance kind of fills that gap if you say, we really need to have a SQL Agent. Well, then you can go with Managed Instance. However, keep in mind that when we're talking about limitations here, we're not saying you can't schedule jobs. Of course you can, because when we get into Data Factory later, we're using Data Factory instead of SSIS to move our data and clean that data up. Instead of using SQL Agent, we're just going to set up triggers inside of Azure Data Factory that automatically kick off those events to happen on either a schedule or when an event occurs. And so instead of using SQL Agent, you can use other tools to schedule your job. Azure SQL Database just doesn't have that out of the box, right? So that is something to keep in mind as you're going through that experience of trying to figure out what do we need in Azure in order to get our applications up and going. These are going to be some of those limitations that you have with Azure SQL Database. So this goes back to Peter's point from earlier. I'm sorry to keep picking on Peter here, but Why do we use Platform as a Service for a database? Why do we use Azure SQL Database? If all those other points that we've already talked about haven't really highlighted these, well, one thing is less maintaining means more time really optimizing and really focusing in on performance tuning that application, performance tuning the code, taking a look at your audit logs and seeing how much is it being adopted, how much are people using it. Another place where I've seen DBAs really thrive in Azure is getting a very strong and solid understanding of price. Maybe one service is better than another. Maybe we can, because I saw a tweet just the other day on Twitter, it might have been this morning when I was flipping through Twitter, where somebody who was working in Azure had done such a great job of performance tuning all of their applications, they were able to scale back all of their databases, saving their customer a ton of money, right? And so if you're focused your time on application optimization, and you can do it now with less resources because your applications are running better, then you can save your company a lot of money. And so that's one of the places that as a database administrator, you really thrive and bring value to your company because you're still optimizing that and managing cost and maybe creating automation scripts to do a lot of that for you. All right. So I talked about this before, and you'll see this here in just a few moments when we create our database and jump into Management Studio, but we get a very familiar SQL experience. We can connect to our SQL database in the cloud the same way we connect to our on-prem environments, and we can do that through Management Studio. So if this is something you're familiar with today, this is going to look very, very familiar to you when we get there. So these familiar tools are once again available to us even when we're connecting to our resources in Azure. All right. So we've talked a bunch about a database. We've talked about the benefits, the highlights, maybe a couple of those limitations. Now what I want to do is I want to jump in and I want to go ahead and create a couple of new resources here. One is going to be our SQL Server, and then the other one is going to be our database. All right. So let me open back up our web browser. We're going to jump back into the Azure portal here, and we're going to go ahead and create a couple of quick resources, and then I'm going to connect to those resources and show you what that looks like. The first resource that we want to create is we want to create what's called a logical server. So unlike in an on-prem environment where you provision all that hardware, you install it, you install all your software, you're not actually buying a physical server, an entire physical server at Microsoft. Microsoft virtualizes all this out. It feels and it looks like your own server, but it's not. But we do need to create what's called a logical server. And that logical server is going to store, just like a logical container that we talked about earlier, it stores all the metadata information about any databases, any elastic pools, any data warehouses that are attached to that server. It stores all of that logical information there, all the metadata information. And so this is going to be really important. We need to have a SQL server. So let's create that real quick, and then we'll come back and create a database. So up here in the very top left in our navigation pane, just like we did before, we're going to click on Create a Resource, and I am going to search for SQL Server. Now this one's a little bit tricky, but I'm going to type in SQL Server, and then I'll start typing in Logical Server, and it should pop up. There it is right there. So I'm going to click on that button right there, and it's going to bring us into this very familiar screen where it says, hey, you want to create a new resource. So we're going to click on Create right here. And when I click on Create, it brings us into that kind of UI-driven creation screen for that resource. And we're going to go through and set up all of our basic and then our networking information here. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and choose a resource group. It's actually incorrectly allocated it to just an automatic resource group that I have here. So I'm going to go down and choose our Azure Workshop, Learn with the Nerds with my initials on it. And then we need to give this server a name. And so the server that I'm going to choose here is going to be PW Learn with the Nerds. By the way, when you're naming things in Azure, you'll notice that some things allow you to put in hyphens, some things are underscores, some things don't let you do either one. Sometimes you can do uppercase, sometimes you can do lowercase. One thing to keep in mind with a server is just like the storage account name that we did earlier, this server name must be 100% unique across all of Azure. So if somebody anywhere in the world who's using Azure has already used that server name, you cannot use it. Once again, the reason for that is because we use that server name when we connect to our databases that are on that server. So we're going to type in PW Learn with the Nerds and then Azure Workshop, and then I'll put my initials right there on the very end. All right, so that has passed the credentials there, and then we'll go over here and click on East US 2. And then I need to give this also a username and a password. So this is a SQL Server account. I'm going to create a SQL Server username and a SQL Server password that allows me to authenticate to that server and then see the databases within that server. So my username will just simply be admin user, and then I'll type in a super secret password here. Whoops. Let's make sure I don't mess that up again. All right, so we have that done. And then, of course, we can go into networking and we can set up some stuff with that, additional settings. We can do that after the fact. And we're actually going to come back and talk about networking here in about the next 15 minutes. So we're just going to go straight to review and create. So resource group, what region do we want to put it in? What's the name of my server? That's it. Once again, this server isn't going to cost us any money. It's just a logical grouping, just like the container that we used earlier. So now down here at the very bottom, we're going to click on create. And once again, in the magical world of Azure, a resource is being provisioned for us. Now, this might take a moment to finish. It shouldn't take too long because it is a logical server, meaning it's not a physical server. It's just some virtualization that's going on in the background. But as soon as this is done, we're going to go provision our database. Now, let me show you something else that's really cool. If I go over to my resource groups right here, I can click on resource groups and I can go back to that resource group that we created. And up here in this administration page, you'll notice right here, I can see the number of deployments that I've done to this resource group, and we can see that we have currently right now a deployment that is taking place. And so if you ever are on that screen and you're creating a resource and you get out of that screen and you're like, I don't know if it's still deploying or not, you can always just go to the resource group and you can see it right there. Also in the property section, once again, there's a lot of great properties in here. There is a section for deployments. There's a lot of benefits to this section, but one of them is that you can go into that deployment section and you can take a look at what's currently deployed, what's been deployed, and if you wanted, you could actually take something and redeploy it again. So it's a quick way of kind of regenerating multiple resources there. All right, so this should be done. Let's check our notifications, and it's not. So what we're going to, oh, there it is. It's finally done. It does take a while sometimes to pop up immediately in our resource group, but we're going to click refresh here at the top. And like I said, it does take a moment sometimes. And there it is. So now we have our SQL server. We can click on that. It'll open up a new blade, but we don't need to do that yet because what we want to do is now create a SQL database that we can attach to that server, and we're going to start querying that database and take a look at it. So this is where stuff starts to get fun, and then after break, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about data factory and connecting to all these different resources. What I'm going to do next is create another resource here. And the resource that I'm creating now is going to be SQL database. So let me search for that. And that opens it right up. And so now I have my SQL database here. And just like the other resources we've created, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. That's going to bring us into that edit screen where we can create our resource. And I'm going to choose my resource group. You'll notice this is very similar. Resource group, location, name. Resource group, location, name. These are going to be like those standard properties that are always required whenever you create a resource in Azure. And so I'll choose my resource group. I'm going to give this database a name. I'm going to go with something like PW, Learn with the Nerds, and then add AdventureWorks because we're going to be using some sample data from AdventureWorks here. And then we want to go ahead and select our server. And so the server that I created here was this one right here, Learn with the Nerds, and I put my initials right there on the end. And so I'm attaching the database to that server. Notice it doesn't even ask me the location because it's automatically going to put my databases in the same location as my server. So it's very important to get the location correct on the server. And then down here at the bottom, there's a couple of important properties that I'm going to pause for just a moment and we're going to talk about. The first one is, do you want to use an elastic pool? Azure SQL database are essentially individual databases that have their own resources allocated to them. This is very different from an on-prem environment. In an on-prem environment, we provision a server and we install all our databases on that server, and they have to compete and they have to share for those resources. A big job of a DBA was kind of managing that, right? In Azure, it's the opposite. Each database has its own resources, but a great way of improving performance and saving money on cost is to create a pool of resources and attach all of your databases to that. That only works if those databases peak at different times, right? So you have some databases that peak in the morning, some in the afternoon. Maybe you got a bunch of like databases that aren't very often used, but when you use them, you want them to have good performance. So those are good candidates for that. But not all databases fall into the candidacy for this. Just keep in mind, if you want something that's similar to an on-prem environment where you have a pool of resources that are shared, elastic pools kind of give you that flexibility. Now, what we do need to do is I need to choose what level of compute, CPU memory, disk space, or disk speed, the speed of my disk for reading and writing, and what amount of storage do we want to set up and configure for this database. And so the way that we do that is we click right here where it says Configure Database. And when I click on that, it takes us to a new tab, and this is where it can be very overwhelming, right? When you're going through the process of essentially provisioning your Azure SQL database, there's two different methodologies here. There's two different pricing structures. One is called vCore, which is the new model. One is called DTU. And the DTU model is the legacy model. We're going to use DTU because it's the easier price to entry here. The vCore model is easier to essentially compare to an on-prem environment. So you say, hey, on-prem we have 32 cores, we're going to go with 32 vCores or something like that. And so it's easier to kind of to set that up with the vCore model. But the old model, the legacy model here that's still there for backward compatibility as well as new databases as well, is what's called the DTU model. Now, what you'll see here is we are currently being brought immediately to the vCore model. And in fact, if I zoom in, let me zoom in for you right here. Right here, it says vCores. Now here's the thing, if I choose 2 vCores, which is the minimal number of vCores I can choose at only 32 gigabytes of storage, over here on the right, we see that that's going to cost me about $380 per month. That is a lot of money if you're just trying to do some basic development and build a proof of concept, right? So that is the minimal entry point for the vCore model. You can go with a little less storage and save a few bucks, but not really a whole lot. Also, you'll notice that general purpose is the lowest level service tier. So you can go with hyperscale, which 2 vCores with hyperscale is $692. You can also go with business critical, $1,021 per month. Now, if you just want to build a proof of concept, you just want to test this out, what we can do is we can go back to where it says basic, standard, or premium right here across the top. That will take us over to the DTU model. And so I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to choose basic here. You have basic, standard, and premium. I'm going to choose basic, and we're just going to go with the basic 5 DTUs. What is 5 DTUs? Well, that's a great question. It's kind of like a black box algorithm. It's some amount of compute, some amount of CPU, some amount of memory, and some amount of speed on your hard drives, right? How fast you write and read your data. So as you go from 5 to 10, that should scale linearly, right? So you should expect double the compute if you go from 5 to 10, double the CPU, double the memory. All right, and so here's the thing. If I go with a basic here, let me scroll back over to the right, which is 5 DTU, it's only 2 gigabytes of storage, that costs me $5 per month. That's a lot less than $1,000 per month. I can build a proof of concept here, and we can do a lot of work with a very minimal cost. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to click on Apply, and now we can actually go in and review and create. Now here's the thing with Azure SQL Database. If you build this out and you realize you need to go up to another higher service tier, you can absolutely do that. You can jump right in here and you can go from 2 gigabytes to 100 gigabytes. You can go from 5 DTUs to 1,000 DTUs. In fact, I don't know if 1,000 DTUs is a real thing. I'm just throwing numbers out. But you can scale it up and you can scale it back down. But you can also change from the DTU model to the vCore model. So if you start with a DTU model and you want to transition over to the vCore model, because it's going to be better for performance, it goes higher up or whatever reason, you can do that. You can take a database and scale between different models as well as scaling up those service tiers. Yep. And so that's the great thing about Azure. You scale it up. So what if I'm running a standard data model with 20 DTUs and it's costing me about 30 bucks per month? But then we come up to end of month reporting and we have to run thousands of reports and we have to generate and we have to process just terabytes of data. What do? Well, I can take that's been costing me about 30 bucks per month and we can scale that up to a higher level. And then when we're done, we can scale it back down and you only pay for what you use. So that's one of the huge benefits when you're working with Azure SQL Database. All right, so let's go ahead and review and we're going to create this resource right here. I messed up. I wanted to create some sample data, so I got to do it again. So that's okay. I'm going to create a new resource here. I got talking about the different services. We're going to take a break in about 10 minutes, and that'll move us to the second section of the day. So let me go ahead and pull in my SQL database. Actually, I have one that's already been created, so let's do that. And I can create the other one when we take a break, because I just want to show you how we can essentially connect to the server and connect to the database using Management Studio. So right here, you'll notice in my backup file, I have a database already created right here called SQL Database, and it has, it's attached to this server. So I'm going to connect to this server from Management Studio. So what I can do is click on the server to open that up from the resource group. And whenever you connect to the server, it's the server name.database.windows.net. So you got to type all that into Management Studio. So I'm going to come over here to the right. On this overview screen, I can come over here and I can copy out that server name. So I'll copy out that server name, and then we're going to go back to everybody's favorite tool for working with SQL, Management Studio, and I'm going to tell it I want to connect. When I open up Management Studio, I want to connect to my database engine. And instead of typing in a local server that's in my on-prem environment, I'm actually going to type in right here, pwlwn, that server name.database.windows.net. Then I'm going to put in my login information and my password. So my super secret password, it'd be funny if that was actually the password, but it's not. And then I'm going to click connect. And what happens is it doesn't allow me to connect because what we haven't done on that server is I haven't given myself access from this IP address. So I can't connect to that. This is your first level of defense in protecting your data, is setting up firewall rules. And so because I am an admin, I can actually cheat and I can click right here, I can sign in and it will automatically add in my current IP address. However, I can also go back over to the Azure portal and I'm going to show you where we can connect right there. And so from your SQL server right here, I can go to the properties pane and I'm going to scroll down to security. And under security, we can set up our firewalls and firewall rules and our virtual networks right here. And I'm going to add this office IP address. So I'll click right here on firewalls and virtual networks. And then up here at the top, I'm going to go ahead and click on add client IP address. And so that just added my IP address for this location. And then I'll give it a name like work office right there. And then I click save. And now when I go back over to Management Studio and try to connect to that server, I will be able to. So we'll do this demo and then we're going to take a break. All right. So I'll hit cancel here. I'm going to try to log in one more time. I'll click on connect again. And now it lets us in. The username worked, the password worked, and you're going to notice that this experience is very similar to an on-prem environment. So I'm connecting to Azure once again from an application on-prem. I can expand my databases here. And the reason I went with this database instead of the one I just created is because we didn't go through the optional parameters and we went with a blank database. But this database I created with sample data. And so we have some tables here that we can work with. And so for example, if I wanted to query this data, I can right click, select top 1,000 rows, just like you would do with an on-prem database. We can select the data, we can write queries to retrieve information from it. The performance here is going to be a little bit lacking with a $5 per month database, right? But you can insert records in, you can delete records, you can do all the stuff that you do with SQL Server on-prem right here in Management Studio, other than the limitations we talked about before. All right, that brings us to 1222 here. We've covered a lot of information this morning as far as just getting started with Azure, creating resources in Azure. What we're going to do is we're going to take a 15-minute break. So we're going to come back at about 12:37-ish Eastern time. I'll put a timer on the screen. And when we come back, we're going to jump into my favorite tool in Azure, Azure Data Factory. And we're going to talk about how do we now take data and move it between different services that we've created. All right, so I'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be right back. Hello and welcome back. I hope you had a good break, got some food, ran to the restroom. What we're going to do now is we're going to dive into the next part of this course. I do want to jump in and remind you once again that we're having a sale that's associated here at the end of the year that's also associated with this event. And for that sale, we're doing 65% off of our on-demand learning. And so if you have an opportunity to take a look at that, we're doing 65% off all of our on-demand learning classes right now at Pragmatic Works, which includes Power BI, SQL, Azure, and of course data science and more. Lots of good classes out there, so sign up today and sign up right now. We also had a lot of questions. Fortunately, the people here at Pragmatic Works are answering a lot of them, and Peter is helping out a lot as well in the chat window. One of the things that I mentioned right before we went on break, talking about Azure SQL Database, and I want to jump back to that and talk about it again, is there's two different models with SQL Database. There's the DTU model and the vCore model. And I want to highlight that a lot of people, including Pragmatic Works, uses the DTU model for production. So the DTU model is absolutely great for production, and you can start off with that model. And it just gives you a low cost of entry into getting into Azure. But the vCore model is going to scale a lot higher and give you some additional capabilities if you need that. But do not think that you need the vCore model. Definitely start with the DTU model, see how that works for you, and then scale up as needed. The other thing I do want to mention is that there are a couple of class files that go along with this class, and we're going to put those in the chat window for you right now. And that gives you a PDF of the PDF of the PowerPoint that we're doing that includes my email address, my contact information, and all of the stuff we went through today. There's also a file in there that has all of the links for today. So where can you go download Azure Storage Explorer? Where can you go for a couple different items? Those are in there for you as well. So please download that and enjoy that. Without further ado, we're going to jump into probably my most exciting part of the presentation we're doing today, and that's going to be Azure Data Factory. So let me go ahead and pull that up on the PowerPoint here real quick. And what we're going to look at is real quick, provisioning Azure Data Factory, doing some Azure Data Factory kind of navigation, and then of course development. How do we build pipelines and data flows that move our data and help us to clean that data up and ingest it into Azure? So what is Azure Data Factory, right? We've kind of alluded to this a couple of times, but I haven't really dove into it. Well, Azure Data Factory is an ETL tool that is based in the cloud. So it's executed, everything that we do in Azure Data Factory is executed using Azure Compute Resources. The development is done in Azure. I'm not doing it in Visual Studio. Ideally, I would be doing it in the Azure portal through the UI, drag and drop interactivity there. And so that's the great thing about Azure Data Factory. The other thing worth mentioning here is that it is drag and drop interactivity. Unlike Azure Databricks, where you're writing a bunch of code and you're writing a bunch of commands, Data Factory is very similar to SSIS on-prem, where if you want to perform an action, you want to do a thing, you grab that activity, you bring it into your pipeline, and you execute it. We'll talk about the components here in just a moment. If you want to write code in Data Factory, and we'll write a little bit of code today just to introduce you to that, and I'll do a follow-up YouTube video that I'll release next week on expression language in Data Factory, so check out that YouTube channel. But if you want to write code, it's really just a pretty easy expression language where you go through the expression builder and you write the code there. So you're still not programming, it's just an expression language. What do we use Data Factory for? Well, we use it for orchestration and we use it for data transformation, data cleansing. And so this is one of the great things about Data Factory is it easily integrates with both your hybrid environment, so your on-prem environment, and your cloud environment. You can use it for both. So that is Data Factory. Provisioning, super easy. You give it a name, subscription resource group, the version. Version 2 is really the only version. The version 1 was writing a bunch of code. Version 2 is awesome. And then you give it your location. Once again, we want that location to kind of match our storage account and our SQL Server databases and other resources that we're building in Azure. All right, and so we're going to walk through kind of Data Factory provisioning. Now, before we jump into that, let's talk a little bit about development and the different resources that are available. When we're looking at Azure Data Factory, the first thing we come across, the first thing we'll probably create is what's called a pipeline. If you come from an SSIS background, this is very relatable to what was called a package. And so a pipeline is essentially a collection of activities, a collection of actions that do work, right? Download a file, copy the file, clean the file up, and then load the file somewhere. So it's a collection of activities that do work. That's kind of what a pipeline is in Azure Data Factory. We also have something called data flows. Data flows, or the data flow activity, is where you do most of your data transformation. So if you need to clean up bad data, merge data together, remove characters, add new columns, any of that kind of stuff in the code, you can do that inside of a Data Factory data flow. Now there's two different types of data flows that exist. The mapping data flow, which looks very, very similar to what you got with SSIS experience, and then also what's called wrangling data flows. We won't touch on wrangling data flows today, but this is a super cool feature. In fact, last week on my YouTube channel, I actually did a video on wrangling data flows. And wrangling data flows are derived from the Power Query Editor in Power BI, or the Query Editor if you've used Query Editor in Excel. It is essentially the UI-driven way of cleaning your data through just right-clicking and saying remove these values, right-click and unpivot data. All of that capability you have in Power BI Desktop will hopefully one day be available in wrangling data flows. It's still in preview, so you don't have all that capability today. But you can do that there. Mapping data flows, that's what we're going to be talking about. That's what we're going to be looking at today. And it looks very much like what you see on the screen. You have your source, you have your transformations that are cleaning the data up and transforming it, getting it ready for that final destination. And then, of course, at the very end, we have the destination. Where are we going to load this data once we're done? Whenever we're working with pipelines or data flows, of course, we have sources and we have destinations. And in order to connect to those, we need to tell Azure Data Factory the connection information. Where's that server at? What are the credentials to access that server? And we do that through something called link services. This is very similar to connection managers with on-prem SQL Server. So if you've worked with SSRS or IaaS or SQL Server Analysis Services on-prem, connection managers are essentially the equivalent of linked services in Azure Data Factory. So that's how you connect to that database. That's how you connect to those storage accounts. And then further defining that connection, we have something called data sets. So link services, once again, this defines the connection information so that Data Factory can connect to those data stores, whether they're your database, your Blob Storage account, your data lake, all the different connections that you can make through these link services. A data set is a very specific named view of your data. So if I'm looking at a database, the data set might be a connection to a specific table or a very specific query that's pulling data from a table, right? And so the data set is more defined than a linked service. And so a data set might be a file or a folder location within a data lake account. And so these are really the resources that we're going to be working with in Azure Data Factory. They have a very strong correlation with the same resources that we used over in SSIS. So if you have that kind of background, very, very relatable resources that we have here. Now within Azure Data Factory, within your pipeline and within your pipeline, we have all these different activities that we can do. And an activity in a pipeline essentially just defines an action that we want to perform on our data. So maybe we want to run a stored procedure where we have a stored procedure that inserts data into a table and removes data or deletes data. We can do that. Maybe we want to run a Databricks notebook. So if you're familiar with Databricks and you've created a notebook that does a bunch of work and you want to execute it directly from Data Factory, you can do that through an activity called a Databricks activity. You can also do things like copy data. You can do a copy data activity, and there's a ton of other activities in there, like a web activity. I have a couple YouTube videos on using Azure Logic Apps to, in conjunction with Data Factory, to extend upon that capability as well. And so there's a lot of different activities, and these activities define the actions that you want to perform inside of Azure Data Factory. Now, because this is a 3-hour presentation, we don't have a lot of slides. We're going to jump right into the demo, and I'm going to show you real quick here how do we provision a Data Factory. So I'm going to go ahead and go back over here to our web browser, and I'm going to create a new resource real quick, and it's going to be that Data Factory resource that we want to create. So we'll go over and click on Create a Resource here in the very top left. I'm going to search for Data Factory. Once again, Data Factory, provisioning this resource does not cost any money just to provision it. You get charged for the pipelines that you run and the amount of resources that those pipeline runs generate, right? The amount of resources that they use. So we can create this Data Factory and it's not going to cost us any money to provision this. So up here in the top left, we'll click Create. Once again, the same exact experience we've seen time and time again. We'll click on Create, and then we have to give it that basic information. So we're going to tell it what is our resource group. It's going to be This one right here, learn with the nerds, with our initial. Then we're going to choose our region. Of course, I'm going to choose East US 2. Once again, the location is important for both production or performance, right? That latency. You want to make sure that, if your entire company is based in the East US, you don't want to create and put all your resources out in the West US because there's going to be latency problems with that and there's going to be some performance with that. You want to ideally put everything in the East US with you. And if I'm putting my storage account and I'm putting my Azure SQL database and I'm putting all of that in the East US too, I also want to make sure my data factory is in there as well. This improves performance and it's going to help you as far as cost is considered as well. So we go ahead and choose the East US 2 and then we're going to give this data factory a name and I'll call it Azure Workshop. Let's see, well, let me do dashes here. Looks like it will. ADF, learn with the nerds. And then we're going to go with version 2. Once again, version 2 is really the only version. Don't go with version 1, trust me. All right, so we'll go with version 2 here. And then there is one more requirement here. We have to tell it right here under Git configuration that we will configure our source control later. That continuous integration and continuous development. I could set it up right now, but I don't really have it set up for this demo and it takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to tell it that I want to configure Git later. The one thing that I will tell you about this is two things. One, obviously we have training. So our advanced Azure Data Factory class does show how to set this up, configure this, and do that CI/CD process. But two, it's actually a pretty easy process to set this up. It's not very difficult at all. And then you take the work that you do in Data Factory and you publish it to your repository, your code repository. And then from your code repository, we build a pipeline release that moves it over and publishes that out to Azure Data Factory in production. And we can set it up to publish that and move it between different environments like dev, QA, and production. So that's what that Git configuration is referencing there. And it's pretty cool, easy to set up. All right, we're going to go ahead and do review and create. There are, of course, some other categories there that we could talk about, but we can't dive that deep today. And I'm going to go ahead and create this data factory. All right, and so this will take a moment to load. It's going to, once we create the data factory, it's just a blank slate where we can go in and start creating connections to our different data sources in Azure. And we can also start creating those pipelines and those data flows and making things happen. So we'll give it a moment to load here. And as soon as it does, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to jump right in and we're going to start creating a couple of connection managers to our data. And it looks like it's done. There we go. It looks like it's done. So what we're going to do is go ahead and go to that resource. Now this time I'm going to cheat. Remember, we've been going to resource groups, going back. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to go back over to my resource groups. I'm going to click on the resource group right here, and we will refresh. There we go. And you'll see we now have a storage account. There's a couple different ways of noticing this. We have our iconography over here on the left, right? So the icon will tell you what type of resource it is. Azure Data Factory, storage account, SQL Server, database, and then SQL Server. So the icon represents it. Also over here under type, it kind of tells you exactly what that is as well. So that's going to be important there as well. Now, I'm going to click on Azure Data Factory. This opens up a new blade in Azure. And this brings us to kind of the administration page. But if we want to do development in Azure, we're going to click on Author and Monitor, which we see right there in the middle of our screen. And then that's going to open up a new tab in our browser, and that's where we're going to build our connection managers, those data sets, our pipelines, and our data flow. So let's jump right in because, like I said, this part is pretty exciting here. We're going to go to Author and Monitor. That's opening up a new tab. And so if you go to my YouTube channel, and that's Mitchell Pearson on YouTube, and my coworkers will throw that in the chat window for you. I have about 10 different videos on Data Factory on how to do quite a few different things in Azure Data Factory, including quite a bit of some of the advanced stuff you can do in there. So that scales up quite a bit from what we're talking about here. And so over here, when you log into Data Factory, this is the first view that you see. You see this Let's Get Started section right here where you can create a pipeline, you can create a data flow, you can copy data, you can also set up your code repository right here. I don't really do anything on this main home screen because you can do all of this stuff in other places where it's designed to be done, but you can do all of it from right here. You can get started. There's also a lot of videos in here, and there's some videos and tutorials. Now most of these are quite old, but they've aged pretty well, right? Data Factory is being updated quite a bit, but most of these aged pretty well, and they give you a good idea of the different things you can do. Over here on the left, we have that navigation pane, very similar that we have in the Azure portal. We can collapse it, we can expand it, and this is the Data Factory page. It used to be called Overview. They renamed it to Data Factory. Then we have the Authoring tab. This is where we're going to be building all of our pipelines and our data flows. This is where the work's going to get done. We have incredible built-in monitoring that comes with Data Factory right out of the box. Just a really great job by Microsoft there. And then we have the Manage tab. Now we're going to actually start with the Manage tab today because this is where we go and create our link services. So I will click down here at the very bottom and click on Manage. And when I click on Manage, it opens up this new window right here, and you'll see over on the left we can create link services, integration runtimes, we can do our Git configuration here, we can do ARM templates here for our source control, and there's some other stuff here as well like triggers, and triggers are of course the scheduled execution. Remember we talked about SQL agent? This is how you do it in Data Factory. We're not going to get into all those things though, but what we are going to do is create a couple of linked services. So up here at the top, I'm going to click on New. And when I click on New right here, it opens up a new window. I'm creating a new connection manager. So I want to create two connection managers here, one to our data lake account, and then I want to create another connection manager to our Azure SQL database, right? So we need those two connection managers so that we can then essentially react or interact with all the different data sources within those. So over here, we're going to create a first new linked service. I'm going to do Azure because both of our data sources are in Azure. And then the first one that we're connecting to is going to be our Azure Data Lake. So I'll grab the Azure Data Lake account right there, which my head is blocking a little bit. There it is, Azure Data Lake right there. And then down here at the bottom, we'll click on Continue. And then it brings us to the new screen right here. And we need to give this a name. Now, I have my own made-up naming convention. You use your own, what works best for you. But what I like to do is I'm going to put in here that the source is Azure, right? It's not on-prem or somewhere else. So it is in Azure. So I'm going to put that. Then I'll put in the type of connection it is. So this is an ADLS account, right? Azure Data Lake Store. And then I'm going to put the name of that storage account. And that storage account was something like Azure Workshop Learn with the Nerds, right? So I'll put the name of the storage account there. So I know it's in Azure. I know what type it is. It's not a blob. It's not a general purpose. And then I put in the name. So that's what I like to, that's how I like to name mine. Then down here, I'm going to tell it we're going to connect using the account key method. If I have time later, I want to talk about Azure Key Vault because as a best practice, we should not be connecting using the account key. We shouldn't be storing that in our code. This also will impact using things like Azure DevOps in your code repository because it won't let you store sensitive information there. So we would rather store our account keys, our sensitive information, our passwords in the Key Vault, and then we can just reference the Key Vault name from here. So I should have a minute here at the end of the presentation today to show you guys that information there. But for now, just quick getting started, we're going to connect to our account key. We're going to pull it using our Azure subscription. And then we're going to tell it that we're using our Microsoft Azure sponsorship. And then our account name is, let's see, storage account name is going to be this one right here with my initials on the end. That's the one we created just an hour or so ago. And then once that's done, we go down to the very bottom down here. I click on Test Connection. That's going to give me the green light. Signal is good. Connection succeeded. And then I click on Create. And so we just created our very first connection manager in Azure. And that is our connection to our Azure Data Lake account. Now I need to create another one. And I want to create a connection to our SQL Server database. So up here at the top, we're going to click on New under Link Services right here. And then I'm going to click on Azure again. And under Azure, I'm going to come over here and find Azure SQL Database right there. It's a couple of rows down, but it's right there. And then I'll click on Continue. And then I need to give this a name as well. So once again, I have my own little naming convention. This is in Azure. It is a SQL database, right? It's a SQL connection. And then the name of that database is going to be AdventureWorks. So I might have multiple different databases within that I want to connect to. And this one, this connection manager here is specifically to that database. So this is going to be our AdventureWorks database. And then I'm going to choose my subscription here. We'll go with Microsoft Azure sponsorship. My server name, very important to get the right one for this one. And that is going to be, let's see, which one I would have done. I have so many servers here. Oh, here it is. The one with my initials, that's the one. But I'm actually going to go with my backup because remember, when I created this database, I didn't go to the additional properties and choose the sample data. So if I go to this server right here, I'm not going to be able to actually have any data. So I'm going to use my backup since I messed that up earlier. So thank goodness we have a backup. And now I'm going to connect to that database right there. That AdventureWorks database has data that we can use. Then I'm going to pass in my username, so admin user. And then once again, I could use Key Vault for my password here instead of typing in the password manually. All right, now we're going to do test connection, and it failed. What happened, right? What's going on here? Why did my connection fail? Well, it failed because Azure Data Factory is a service in Azure, and it cannot connect to our Azure server. So this is another time when we got to go back to our Azure server, go into the firewall rules, and take a look at those properties there. So let me show you what's going on over here. If I click on more, and you read through this, it's a lot of information, but eventually you're going to see that it cannot open the server requested by the login, and it tells us it's a problem with this IP address. Well, that IP address right there, 20.41.3.129, is not my IP address. You saw that earlier. I shared it with you earlier with the whole world. That's not my IP address. That's the one for the virtual machine that's running in the background that Azure Data Factory is using to try to connect to the server. So what does that mean? Well, let me show you what that means. This is where we get to dive a little bit deeper into Azure SQL Server. I'm going to go back over to my Azure portal. I'll go back into my resource group here by scrolling back over. Remember, we can scroll horizontally. And I'm going to click on the server that we created earlier in this class. And when I click on that server right here, SQL Server, you see it right there, we can go down to Security. And under Security, we're going to go to Firewall Rules and Virtual Networks. We were here earlier. We added an IP address earlier. And when I go in there, you will see, I need to go back to the other resource group real quick because of the server that we're connecting to. So we need to make sure we connect to the right one. We're going to go to this server right here, and then I'll go over to my security again, and we go into Firewall Rules and Virtual Networks. And here's the IP I added earlier, 45, but the one that Data Factory was using was like 21, right? Well, here's the thing. You'll notice right here that there is an option to allow Azure Services and resources in Azure to access this server. What does that mean? What that means is that any service in Azure can now try to authenticate to this server. And that's a little bit of a concern from a security perspective for a lot of customers, right? Because if I'm on an Azure VM, I now, if that is on from my Azure VM, so I might be in a completely different company, completely across the world, I can try to connect to your server and try to different combinations of username and passwords to try to log in to your server, right? And so that's a little bit of a risk there. That's a little bit of a concern. But other than just adding the IP address from that virtual machine to make this work temporarily, I would need to go ahead and turn this on. And so I'm going to turn this on so that Data Factory works with this. That IP address that you saw in Data Factory is dynamic, so it changes. So even if you have it work temporarily, it's not going to work the next time more than likely, right? So to make this work, we're going to go ahead and turn on Azure Services here. And then up here at the top, I'm going to go ahead and click Save to save my changes. And now when I go back over to Azure Data Factory and I test connection again, if that worked, it now successfully connects, right? So it now successfully connects and it works. So the problem there was that we didn't have access to the server, but we gave it access. Now, we are going to click Create, and we now have 2 connection managers that we have created. That's going to be step 1. What I want to do is, in this example, I want to take data that lives in my AdventureWorks database, and I want to copy it to my Azure Data Lake, right? The data that I want to copy from AdventureWorks is just going to be product data. So I'm going to take my product data for today's date, the most up-to-date version, and I'm going to copy that over to a container. Remember, a logical container for grouping those files together in our data lake. And so the first thing I need is I need a data set that points to my product table in Azure Data Factory, and another data set that points to the file that I want to write it to in Data Lake. So we have our link services. Now what we're going to do is over here on the left-hand side, I'm going to go to Author, and under Author, we are going to go ahead and create a couple of data sets. Now, before we jump right into that, there's a couple of resources here, right? We have pipelines, we have data sets, and we have data flows. We talked about those in the PowerPoint. The pipeline is like the highest level here. The pipeline essentially is a collection of all of those different items, the different activities that does the work, and it does the orchestration as well. The data set is separate from the pipeline, and so are the data flows. Interestingly enough, if you come from an SSIS background, you notice it's separate. And that's because these are very reusable. There's a lot of benefits you get in Data Factory that just did not exist in SSIS. And a lot of them is the reusability of components, as well as some other stuff we'll talk about here. Very exciting stuff though. So I'm going to go into data sets here, and we're going to create a new data set. So there's a little ellipsis that pops up when you hover over right here, that little 3 dots. We click on that, and then I'm going to tell it, let's create a new data set. So we're going to create a new data set here, opens up all the way over on the right-hand side. And then on the right-hand side here, we are going to search for, inside of Azure, we're going to create a data set for Azure Data Lake Gen 2. So I'll grab that right there and click Continue. And then out of the different options that we have available right here, I'm going to go ahead and grab delimited text. I'm going to grab that CSV file right there. And then I'll click Continue again. And so these are the different types. Now I will say, I'm seeing Parquet file types show up more and more, and there's a lot of benefits with that. It's schema, it stores and saves the schema. You also get column level compression within those files that gives you great compression. SQL On Demand with Azure Synapse gets like 14 times better query performance with Parquet. And then Databricks has done a lot of stuff around that as well. So from a organizational perspective and planning, you might want to dive into the world of Parquet files if you're starting to make some kind of big migration. But for this demo, we're going to go with CSV files and we're going to click Continue. And then I have to give this data set a name. So the data set here is, once again, I have my own little naming convention. I'm going to do Azure. It is ADLS account. It's in my Azure Workshop storage account. And then this is my product list, right? So I have where it's at, what type of connection it is, the specific storage account, and then the name of the file that I'm writing this to. And then under link service here, I'm going to tell it that this is the link service I want to use. Remember, we created that connection manager earlier. And then I have to tell it where I want to store the file that I create. Now, I want to store this in a container called products, but we don't have a products container. In fact, if I click on the browse button right here, the only one we have is employees because that's the one we created earlier. But I don't want to have to go back to my storage account and create a new container over there. So the cool thing is that if I type in file system right here, products, when this runs, if the container doesn't exist, it'll actually create it automatically, right? So I'm going to type in products, and then under file, I'm just going to give this a name. So we'll call this product list.csv file. And then I'm going to tell it I want to do the first row as header. So the first row is going to be our column headers. Then import schema, this one can get you. We need to choose none. We can't really import a schema from the file because it doesn't even exist yet. We haven't created it. We're going to create it. So we have to do none here in order to make this work. Now, what I'm going to do from there is down here at the very bottom, we're going to click OK, and we have created our destination data set where we're going to load this data once we're done. Now, you'll notice once you get done creating it, there are lots of options in here. You can go through and change these options. You can change the compression type, row delimiter, column delimiter, escape characters. There's lots of information in here that you can definitely modify. The other thing I want to point out is I just created our first resource in Data Factory other than a connection manager, and notice it shows up as a tab across the top. So as you open up new resources and you create new resources, they'll keep showing up across the top there. So you want to make sure that you save your work often by clicking Publish All, and then you close them out whenever you're not needing those. Also, I won't talk about it here, but I'm going to try to squeeze it into the YouTube video that I post next week for you guys. Parameters are a really great way of making this data set right here reusable. So instead of having a data set that's dynamic for product list, it could be employee list, product list, salesperson list, all those different lists. That's one of the powerful things and capabilities that you get in Azure Data Lake or Azure Data Factory, too many Azures. Azure Data Factory is that you can parameterize this and make it very dynamic and very automated. We won't get to that today, but I could very easily make that file name right there dynamic through parameters and expressions. And I know that's something you're interested in if you are coming from a SQL Enterprise BI background. All right, so that's it. We need to create another data set, and we need one that points to the products table in our SQL database. So I'll click on the ellipsis here, just like we did before, right where you see that little 1 right there. If you hover over it, an ellipsis shows up. And then I'm going to click on New Data Set. And the data set that we're creating is going to be to our SQL database. So I can either search for it here, or I can just click on Azure and scroll down a couple screens. And I'm going to grab Azure SQL Database right there and click on Continue. And then we give this a name. So just like I did before, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is in Azure. It is a SQL database. I'll give it the name of the database, so it's AdventureWorks. And then I'll give it the name of the table. All right, so I'll call this my product table. We're going to go ahead and connect to our link service right here, which is our AdventureWorks database. So you see the naming convention. This is mine. This is the one I like to use, but create your own if you like. And then I'm going to go grab saleslt.product. And this time I actually do want to import the schema. Now, one of the things about Data Factory, and I have a video on this where I talk about rule-based mapping and some very dynamic stuff you can do, is what Data Factory does, one of the huge advantages it has over SSIS, other than the fact that it can work better with kind of hybrid data sources on-prem and cloud, one of the big benefits you can get from essentially Azure Data Factory is you get the benefit of being able to do what's called late arriving schema. You don't have to know your schema up front. You don't have to know all of the column names and the data types. They can actually change, and Data Factory can handle that. If you remember from SSIS, for those of you who came from that background, with SSIS it was very metadata rigid. If your source changed and it added a column or removed one or data types changed, all your packages broke. You had to go back in there and fix everything. You can set up Data Factory to not worry about the schema, and it just becomes dynamic. But we're going to go ahead and import it here, and then I'll go down to the bottom and click OK. And that's it. We now have our second data set right here. Now, one thing I want to do right now is I want to go to the top and click Publish All. And when I click that button, Publish All, what it does is it's going to save all of the work I've done so far out to Data Factory kind of in production, so I don't lose it. If I close my browser, if my computer crashes, I lose all my work that's not saved, right? This is in the cloud. So I want to make sure I publish this right now. And there we go. It opens it up. It says I had 2 new items. I did that a little quick, but we're going to do it a couple more times. And down at the bottom there, I clicked Publish, and it saved all of that work. Now, if you set up source control, you set up Azure DevOps, you would be actually saving that to your code repository, not publishing to Data Factory. But that's another topic for another day. So we have 2 data sets. Now we want to move the data from our database over to our data lake. How do we do that? Well, we're going to create a pipeline. So right up here, I'm going to click on that ellipsis right there, and I'm going to tell that I want to create a new pipeline, and that's going to open up a new pipeline. I want to give it a name. So all the way over on the right, it's going to open up a properties window here, and I'm just going to call this something like copy product extract or copy product list, right? So we give it a name, and then I'll click right there to close that properties window. And then we need to start using activities. So the way we do things within a pipeline is through different types of activities that exist. One activity that we can use is under move and transform, and we can use what's called the copy data activity. It doesn't transform data, it doesn't apply business rules or logic, but it just copies the data, which in this example is exactly what I want. So I'm going to grab the copy data activity, drop it right here in our pipeline, and now we have to set that up. So let's look at the properties of that activity. Before we jump too far, you'll notice there's a lot of other categories of activities. And so if you want to explore this and have fun, absolutely go ahead and do that. Under General is where I use a lot of the activities that I do in Data Factory. They're your basic activities. Execute another pipeline, setting up and doing some stuff with variables. Execute an SSIS package. This is interesting. So this does not mean you can execute any SSIS package. What this means is that if you have set up Azure Data Factory where you can take your SSIS packages and deploy them to this Data Factory, you can then use this activity to execute those SSIS packages. So you might have a series of activities, and then once those are done, then you kick off the SSIS package. So that only works if you're using the SSIS integration runtime within the Data Factory. All right? That's part of what's called SSIS lift and shift. So there's that, there's get metadata, lookup activity, stored procedure, and there's a few other really awesome options available right there. And then what we're going to do is let's set up this copy data activity. Now, the way you set them up here is a little different than kind of Visual Studio. Down here at the bottom is where we get all of our properties for this activity. And we can come in here and give this a name. So obviously naming is important. So we'll say, copy data to ADLS or copy product data or something like that. Then we have to go over to our source and our sink. Now sink means destination. So if you're familiar with, I use destination still. I always say destination. And there's a couple other things I want to point out. Notice right here we have these ones. They're in red. That means that there is a required parameter there. This is not done until that one goes away. So we have to provide what is the source. We have to provide what is the sink. Those are required elements for setting up this activity. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the source. And then I'm going to choose one of the data sets we already created. The source is going to be our product table in our Azure SQL database. And then our sink, let's go ahead and look at this so I don't go too quickly here. You'll notice that we're going to just use a table. We could write a query if we wanted. We could also execute a stored procedure here. Our sink destination is going to be that Azure Data Lake account. Copy behavior, I'm going to leave all of, I'm just looking over it real quick. We're going to leave all of the basic stuff here. We're not changing anything. And then under mapping, I could import the schema from the source and the destination and manually map it. Or one of the great things about Data Factory is we could just let it map it automatically based on whatever schemas are coming from our data sets. So it's a late arriving schema and we just let it map it however it wants. That is awesome, awesome feature. And that's what we're going to use. We're not going to import it. We're not going to manually do the mapping. We're going to let it automatically take place. And so what do we do now? Well, up here at the top, I'm going to run this in debug. This is kind of testing mode for Azure Data Factory. And when you run it in debug, I'm running the most recent copy of that pipeline. Meaning I'm not running what's been published out to Azure Data Factory. I'm running any changes that have been made, even right here. And so I want to run this in debug real quick. And you see that it's going to kick off. It tells me right here that it's running. Down here at the bottom, as long as you don't have any activity selected, you'll see an output window. And under that output window, if I click refresh, we'll see the copy activity ran, when it started, the duration of that run, and if it succeeded or not. So if it succeeded, we should be able to go back to our Azure Storage account and take a look at that file. And we can do that two ways. We can either go back through Azure, or we can actually do this in Azure Storage Explorer. So let's do Storage Explorer. Just to give you another look at that tool, right? So if I go back over to Storage Explorer, this is what we had before. We had one blob container called employees with one file. After running Data Factory, we should have a new blob container. So we're going to do a refresh called products. And within that, we now have a file called product list. That's how easy it is to set up a very simple Data Factory just to move data. Now I want to show you, we have quite a bit of time left. I want to dive a little bit into the expression language here. And like I said, I'll do a YouTube video follow-up to dive a little bit deeper into it than what I'm going to show you here. But what I can do with this is we can make this naming dynamic. So how do we do that? Where do we set up a dynamic name in Data Factory? Because remember, all the pieces are separate, right? The data set, the connection manager, the data flow, the pipeline, they're all separate entities. So if I go back over to our browser here, and I'm going to go ahead and publish everything again. When you click publish at the top, it opens up this window. It tells you all the changes, if anything's new, if anything's been edited. And then at the bottom, we click publish. And this publishes it to production. That way you save your code. Publish early and publish often. And that'll be done in just a moment. But while that's running, I'm going to go over to our data set called product list. Remember, this is the data set that connects to our Azure Data Lake account, right? And then watch what I'm going to do here. In the data set, you see I'm selecting it across the top. I'm going to go over here to where we have the file name. The file name is product list. And I'm going to click in that box right there. And when I click in that box, you see something that pops up just below it that says add dynamic content. This is where we can use that expression language to make this dynamic and to automate this. So I can click on add dynamic content here, and it opens up this expression experience within Azure Data Factory. And so I can add dynamic content here. You'll notice down here across the bottom, there's a lot of different types of functions. There's collection functions. We're working with like arrays. If you want to convert your data, if you want to work with any kind of date functions, there's a logical functions, return a true or false value, mathematical, and string functions. And so what we're going to do is I want to combine product list with the date. All right, product list with the date. How do we do that? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my string functions and I'm going to grab the concat operator. So concat is going to do a concatenation where you combine multiple strings together. So that's the first thing. And then I'm going to bring in our first parameter. So the first parameter is going to be a hard-coded text value called product list. And then I'm going to do underscore and then single quote and then comma. The comma here just tells me, okay, I'm ready for the next string that we're going to concatenate. Now, by default, what's happening here is I don't really have a good way of getting the date. I can't type it in. So I'm going to come down here to my date functions. And in the date functions, there's one in here called UTC now. All right. And so I can come down here and find UTC now. I can click on it, and then it adds it up here as well. And so now what I'm doing, let me hit enter again so it's easier to see. I'm taking the word product list and I'm going to combine that with the result of UTC now. Now I'm going to add one more variable in here. And we're going to tell it that we want to also make this .csv. So we're doing product list, UTC now, the date, and then we're combining CSV to the very end. So this is pretty cool. There's no real good way to test it here, but we can go ahead and click finish. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our pipeline. I'm going to run debug real quick. And so I went over to the pipeline, I hit debug, it's running again. And so in about 10 seconds here, it's going to be done. And so let's go ahead and click refresh. And we can go back over to our favorite tool here, Azure Storage Explorer, and we can refresh the window, and what do we get? We now get the product file as a CSV file with the date and the timestamp. Now, I don't really want the timestamp on the end, so I'm going to I could build a lot more on this. You might notice that it says 6:17, it doesn't say 1:17. So there's a function where you can convert from UTC time to my time zone, which would be Eastern Standard Time. I could do that. I could also do some other stuff, but we're going to keep it really simple. We're just going to take the first 10 digits from this. We're going to take the first 10 digits, just the date. So let's do that real quick, and then we're going to move on to our next demo. So this gives you a little bit of an introduction into expressions, right? So I'm going to go back over to Azure Data Factory, and I'm going to go back into that data set that we were making dynamic earlier, and we're going to go back into that expression editor. And so what I want to do is with UTC now, I only want to bring back the left 10 characters. Well, there's not a left function, but there is a substring function, right? And so for all of you SQL gurus out there, you're going to be very familiar with this function. It's called substring. And so if I click on that, it'll add it up here at the top, and it got rid of UTC now. So let's go grab that next. So I'll go back down. I could type it in, but I'm going to just do it through the UI. And there we go. We'll add in, we have substring UTC now, and then what I want to do with substring is I want to return starting from the ordinal position 0 through the first 10 characters. Now if you've done this in SQL, the ordinal position would be 1, so that's important to know the difference there. And then I do need to add a comma here at the end to separate my date and then the CSV file. All right, so we are going to go over here and click Finish, and then we'll run it again by going back to the pipeline, and then we'll do debug again. And we'll just see if this works. Once again, we could do a lot more with this example. We could convert it from UTC time. We could add a lot more here. We could actually parameterize the file name. Instead of being product list, it could be product employees or whatever we pass in. So that's where parameters make this even more robust. But if you download the file, it will fail due to the period in the file name. Oh, is there a colon there? Sorry, I can't see it. Whoops. I've never even, that's a great one. That's from Peter. I've never even tried to download it like that before, Peter, because I always get rid of that. If you're talking about the colon that gets created from that timestamp, I always get rid of that anyway. But if that is the case, and it essentially creates an unstable file, we would go back to that expression language, kind of like what I just did, and you remove those characters or replace them. So great feedback there. And sorry, this other screen's a little bit small here. All right. So let's see. We are going to go check it out. Let's go back over to Azure Storage Explorer again and refresh it again. And let's see. Here we go. Now we get the product list with the date. This is beautiful. And we're able to kind of combine the simplicity of Azure Data Factory and how easy it is with those UI-driven activities with the expression language, which, as you saw, very similar to any other expression language I've used in any other tool, right? Really easy to pick up and work with there. The only thing I wish was there, and maybe it is, maybe I just don't know about it, is a way of being able to actually test it right there in the expression window instead of having to run it and see what the result is after the fact. And so that's just not something I've dug into, but still really cool what we can do there. Now, we're going to go and take a look at data flows. Data flows, if we go back over to Azure Data Factory here, data flows are where we're going to do the bulk of our transformation and data cleansing, right? And so with a data flow, right down here, over here in our factory resources, we're going to go ahead and create a data flow now. And we're going to create a data flow that, what I want to do is I want to take the products and the product category and I want to merge those tables together. Now you know and I know that both of those tables are in a SQL Server database. They're in the same SQL Server database, so we could just write a query to do that. I know. We're going to pretend like our product category is coming from some Excel file and our product table is coming from the database, and we want to merge them without having to load the data into SQL, right? So we're going to have to use our imaginations here, because the more effective way to do this, I would recommend, is we write queries in SQL to do the joins and we do all the work. But I want to show you how to use mapping data flows, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the product category, the product, we're going to combine those tables together so our products now have the category as well with the category ID. We're then going to use a couple of transforms in there to get you familiar with data flows. Now, one thing I need to do right now, and I should have done it a couple minutes ago, I need to turn on data flow debug here at the top. I'll explain that in a minute when we have a little bit of dead time, which we will have. So now I'm going to go over to data flows and click on the ellipsis, and I'm going to tell it that I want to create a new mapping data flow. Mapping data flows are your consistency with SSIS on-prem, but we also have something else here called wrangling data flow. This is in preview. There are some missing options, but remember, wrangling data flows are essentially Power Query Editor inside of Azure Data Factory. So if you love that experience with Power BI and you've done a lot of ETL with the Power Query Editor, you can now do this at scale. What do I mean at scale? When you run a data flow in Azure Data Factory, whether it's a mapping data flow or a wrangling data flow, Microsoft takes that work that you've done in the UI, it spins up a Databricks cluster in the background, and it converts your code to Scala, and it runs it against the Databricks cluster. And those Databricks clusters can handle massive amounts of data, so it scales it out. It becomes very scalable, right? And so whereas within Power BI, when you're using the Power Query Editor, you're kind of limited to the memory on your machine or what you have in the service. If you're doing it here in Azure Data Factory, you have massive scalability. So that's awesome. Once again, we won't do wrangling data flows today, but I do have a video that I just posted recently on my YouTube channel. You can go take a look and see if that's something that you would like to explore. So what I'm going to do is click on data flows right here. We're going to do mapping data flows and click OK. And since this is a brand new data factory, it's trying to give us some hints and some tool tips here on what to do. I'm going to click X right there. And then what I want to do here is I need to bring in my data source. Now, we're going to have two data sources. We're going to have one for our product, which we already have, and then we're going to need another one for our product category. So I'm going to go ahead and create, before we go any further, let's create another data set, and we need a data set for our product category. So I'll go ahead and do a new data set right here, and that's going to be over here on the right. And then under Azure, we're going to go down to Azure SQL Database. There we go. And click Continue. And then up here at the top, we're going to give this a name. So this will be Azure _ SQL. And then, of course, it's a data set, so I'm going to tell it the name of my database. It's going to be AdventureWorks. And then I'm bringing in product category, right? So that's the name of the table within that database in Azure in the SQL Server connection that I'm using. And then I'll grab my linked server here, and I'm going to use Azure SQL AdventureWorks. And then I'm going to choose my table name. And so for my table name, I'm going to grab product category here. And once again, I will go ahead and take the schema from the database. So I'm going to bring in that information, the metadata, what are the column names, what are the data types. And then I will go ahead and click OK down here at the very bottom. And that creates that data set that we need, like so. And so now I can go back right here to my data flow, and we're going to add two sources. One is going to be our product, and then one's going to be our product category. So I'll do product first. And down here at the bottom, I'll give this a name. I'll call it source products. And then for data set, I'll go ahead and grab the product data set that we already created, right? So that's all I'm going to do here. I could turn off allow schema drift if I want to be metadata rigid. It should always be the same columns. They should always be the same data type. I could turn that off. Leaving it on gives you more flexibility if it ever changes. So it depends on what you want. I'm going to turn it off. All right. Then I am going to go ahead and click on the other source we have here, and I'm going to call this one source product categories. All right. And then for that data set, we're going to connect to our product category data set that we created that brings all the information from that table. Once again, I'm going to turn off allow schema drift. I don't want that on for this example. And then, so now we have two sources. We want to join them together. We want to do a join. If you're in Excel, we want to do a VLOOKUP, right? If you're in Power BI, Query Editor, we want to do a merge. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to click right here where we have this little plus button, and this is where you can choose to add additional transforms. So this is very different than Visual Studio. It's very different than even pipelines. You don't get a list of all the transforms, and you can't just drag them in. You actually add them like this. And so I'm going to click right there on that plus button, and we are going to bring in a join condition. Now, I wish we could dive into all these different transforms because they're super cool, but there's other things in here like derived column and select and aggregate and creating a surrogate key if you just want to kind of create an index value there. We're going to go ahead and grab the join right there. And what I'm telling is I want to join products to product category so we can get the category name and we can get the category ID. So then down here at the bottom, let me pull this up a little bit. We can choose the type of join we want to do. I won't get into what those different types mean because of time, but I'm going to choose left outer, keep everything from the product table, even if it doesn't have a match in the category table, right? That's what we're going to do. And then we're going to do a join on the product category ID. So I know, because I know this data, that the join condition is going to be on the product category ID. So we'll go ahead and grab that. And that's kind of weird. Oh, I got to choose my right stream. I'm sorry. So the left stream, the first input is products. The second input is going to be product categories. I missed that. And then we're going to go ahead and select our column here, and it's going to be product category ID. All right, so we've done our join condition and we're done. Now I know in SSIS, if you were doing a lookup, you would do the join and then you would choose what columns you wanted. This is a little bit different. It's a separate operation. So we've done the join, we have 22 columns. Now I want to do a select operation that gets rid of all the columns I don't want. So once again, zooming in, we'll click on the plus icon right here. We get a list of all the transforms available. And then the transform that we want is going to be called select. Very simple. So we'll click on select, and there's two different things we can do with select. We're going to go ahead and get rid of the columns we don't want. And then we're also going to rename columns and give them an alias here as well. So getting it better and more prepared for the final destination. So with select being selected there, we're going to come down to the bottom. And I'm going to drag this way up here. I'm going to pull up my properties window all the way up. And I'm going to start deleting columns that I want to get rid of, right? And so if I go down to the very bottom here, we have some things like modified date. I don't care when the product categories were last modified. I don't care about the GUID. I do care about the category name. We want to keep that one. So I'm going to go ahead and alias that real quick right here. And we'll call that category name, like so. I also want to drag this up to the top. I want this to be at the beginning of that file. So I'm going to grab it and pull it all the way up to the very top here. And I'm going to move it up even another step, like so. And then let's get rid of some other stuff we don't care about. I don't care about parent product category ID. I don't care about product category ID from categories because we have that in product. And then I'm going to get rid of that, like so. And so this is what you would do. You come in here and you get the information that you need, get rid of what you don't want. And then I do want product category ID, so I'll drag that to the top. And so now we have about 10 or 12 columns here. And this is what's going to show up in the final destination when we get done here in just a little bit. And so that's what the select transform does. Now, you'll notice that we can preview our data here, and this will show us a preview of what we've done. That only works if we turn on data flow debug. I'll talk more about data flow debug in a minute because we're going to have a pause and it'll make sense to talk about it then. But you only get this option if you've spun up a Databricks cluster in the background that you can use for debugging purposes, and that's how you do it. Now, we've brought in our source, we've brought in our products, we've done a join, we've gotten rid of the columns we don't want. Now I want to use a derived column in Azure Data Factory. This is probably the most common transform in SSIS, and I'm sure it will be here as well. With the derived column, I want to check the category name that we brought from the product category table. If it did not return a value, if there was no match, it was null, it was unknown, we want to replace it with something else, right? And so we're going to do just a very simple expression here in the derived column transform to make this work. So let's do that. We're going to dive back in here, and I'm going to click on that plus icon once again. And I'm going to tell it that I want to do a derived column right here under schema modifiers. And that's going to open up this window across the bottom. My incoming stream is going to be the last stream right here called select one, so that's correct. And then you'll notice I can either add a new column or I can replace an existing column. I'm going to go ahead and replace an existing column, or the value of that existing column, which is category name. So I'll click the drop down here. I'm going to grab the category name. Luckily for me, I moved it to the top, so it's right there. And then over here under Enter Expression, I am going to open up what's called the Expression Builder. This is a little bit different than what you saw in the pipeline, but I'm going to click on Open Expression Builder here, and you're going to see there's a lot of functions. I mean, there are a lot of functions in here that you can use to clean your data and get it ready to really curate that data, right? What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use a very simple one called if null. And what this does, and it does give you a definition if you hover over it, like so. Here we go. Make sure that shows up on the screen. It checks that the value is not null. So if the value is not null, meaning it returned a value, it will go ahead and it'll return that value. If it is null, it'll return my optional result. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to grab that, and that adds it up to my expression. The next thing I want to do is I want to check the category name. So I'll go over to Input Schema, which is all of the columns from my table, and I'm going to bring in the category name right there, and I'm going to say, look, check category name to see if it's null. If it's not null, good, keep the name. If it is null, then I want to return something like not applicable, right? And so I can do that, and that is how we would come in here and replace those null values. Very simple. And you can do this for all your columns. You can do those data cleansing operations and really clean that data up. But we're going to click Save and Finish. And then we need to create our destination. And we once again want to load this into an Azure Data Lake, and we want to create a file in our Azure Data Lake. But there's a little bit of a limitation here as far as the way a data flow works and the way a pipeline works. In a data flow, remember in the background, what's it using? It's using Azure Databricks. And Azure Databricks is Managed Spark. Managed Spark is designed to work with big data. So when it's writing data, it's doing it in parallel operations. And when it's reading data, it's trying to read lots of small files that's going to work better for performance. And so if I do a sync destination right here, by clicking that button and then going to the very bottom and grabbing a sync, the default behavior of this sync destination is that I can't give it a file name. It says, don't give me a file name. We're going to create random file names so that we can write this in parallel and improve performance. And that's good if you have big data. But if you have small data files, you can give it a name and you can kind of make that a single threaded operation, right? So you can combine the data back together before it writes the data and you can give it a name. So let's do that real quick. So we do need to create a new data set. So instead of creating one from scratch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the data set right here called product list from before. I'm going to click on the ellipses and then I'm going to tell it that I want to clone that existing. So I'm making a copy of it. And when I copy it, it'll give me the copy across the top. Let me make sure that that's the one. It is. And I want to give it a name, a better name than copy, because this is really going to be my category list. There we go. And with that data set being created, I need to go ahead and get rid of the name because it will complain about the name. I don't have time to show you the error message, but it will complain. So we're going to get rid of the name. And then we're almost done with this demo, and then we got Azure Synapse. We're going to jump in and talk about Azure Synapse because it's really cool. So that is going to give us a blank name for this file. Now, when I go back over to my data flow here, and I go back into that sync, down here across the bottom, we now need to go ahead and set this up and configure it. So I'm going to give it the data set name, category list, and then what I want to do is I'll get rid of allow schema drift. I don't care about that, or leave it on. It doesn't matter. Over here under settings though, I'm going to make this output to a single file. When I do that, it's going to tell me you have to set this up as a single partition. It can't be multiple files being written. You have to set this up as a single partition, which can affect performance. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I could also go to optimize and done that manually. And now let's give it a name real quick, product category.csv. And so what we've done, let's recap real quick what we've done in this data flow because it's done. We're ready to go. We have brought in two separate data sources and we merged them together so we could get the category ID and the category name. Then we got rid of all the columns we didn't want. So we selected them and through that process we renamed a couple of columns. We used derived column transform to clean some data up, get rid of some bad data, remove those nulls, and then finally we use the sync destination to load the data into Azure Data Lake. Now, how do we run this? Well, I can't run the data flow by itself. I can't run it. So what you have to do is you run the data flow from a pipeline. So we're going to actually create another pipeline real quick right here across the top. I'll click on the ellipsis over pipelines. We'll create a new pipeline. And on this new pipeline, I am going to bring in the data flow activity. And we'll drop that right here in the interface, right? So I'm bringing in a data flow activity. It asks me if I want to use an existing or create a new one. We've already created it, so we're going to use existing here. And then I am going to choose the data flow. I didn't give it a name. I should have, but that's going to work. So we'll say, hey, let's execute that data flow. Then what I'm going to do is up here across the top, I'm going to tell it, let's run this in debug. We've already got the data flow debug running. So let's run it. This will take a minute, and this will take about a minute and a half to run probably. And I'm going to click the background here so we can see the output. All right. So we got a moment to pause and freeze while this runs. What's going on? When you run a data flow runs against a Databricks cluster in the background. Microsoft manages literally all of that for you. So you don't have to go to Databricks and create clusters and keep them running all the time for your pipelines. At execution time, Microsoft will spin up a Databricks cluster in the background. It will run your code against that Databricks cluster, and then once it's done running, you have your results and it shuts down that Databricks cluster. So you only get billed for what you use. In order to debug this and test this in Data Factory, I had to turn on this data flow debug up here at the top. That data flow debug button is me manually turning on a Databricks cluster for testing purposes. So that's running in the background. The benefit of me turning that on is if I did not turn that on and catch that about 7 minutes ago, that would not be on right now and we'd have to wait about 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes for that to provision. So you want to make sure you turn that on. And so this is running this against a Databricks cluster. It's queued it up. It takes about, should be done here in the next few seconds. But it does take a little bit longer because in the background it's doing all that work against Databricks. Now, if you have a lot of data, it's going to obviously give you significant performance improvement because it can scale that out across multiple computers, multiple compute nodes within Databricks. All right, so we'll refresh this a couple more times and then we'll go over to Azure Storage Explorer, take a look at that, and then we're going to have a conversation here over the next 15 or so minutes where we talk about Azure Synapse. How does that fit into the picture? Because that's the big topic right now in the world of Azure, is the release of Azure Synapse in general availability. All right, and then I think we have a question here. Can you reuse data flows across workflows? Are you being billed? So you are being billed when you turn on the data flow debug. You are, because it is spinning up resources and you are getting charged for that. I've never seen it be a lot of cost. So obviously Microsoft is going to spin up the smallest cluster that it needs to spin up so that you're not getting charged a lot of money, but you do. Can you reuse data flows across workflows? You can use them across pipelines, absolutely. And that is phenomenal because when you combine the parameterization capability, the expressions capability, and then the ability to turn off schema, so you don't have to know what the schema is. So I can pass in products for one run into the source. I can pass in employees for the next run. I can pass in sales for the next run. When you have that schema drift capability, it can be massively dynamic, whereas back in SSIS it couldn't be, right? Back in SSIS you had a package and you had a data flow in that package and it was only used there. Now we at Pragmatic Works actually had developed some software around making those data flows more reusable, but Data Factory has it right out the box, which is awesome. Now, let's go check and make sure we have our product. I'm going to go over to our storage account this way this time. Let's go and look at right here, our containers. I dropped it probably in the products table. So let's refresh it. Let me go check where we put that because we created a new data set. So we have to look at the data set that we created for our category list. It's going to the products in my Azure. I might be in the wrong storage account. That's the problem with having a backup here. All right. Let's go over here and refresh it. I think this is the one we're looking for. There it is. So there we have our product category, and now we have our category with the name, and we've been able to combine those and clean up any null values and all the columns that we don't want. All right, that's Data Factory. There's way more to Data Factory. I have at least 10 or 11 videos on Data Factory, and I'm releasing new ones every month. Not every week, but every month I have a new video that I release. So check out my YouTube channel, or even better, check out our on-demand training at Pragmatic Works where you can go through our intro and advanced course, and it's a lot of material. Now, I want to take a look at Azure Synapse because it's awesome. I've already provisioned it in advance. It's super easy to provision, but I knew we were going to be running, or we're actually running exactly on time where I thought we'd be. So we won't get into Azure Key Vault. We won't get into Azure Key Vault, but we will talk about Azure Synapse Analytics. So if I go back over to my resource groups, I have a resource group for backup here called my Azure Workshop, Learn with the Nerds. And in there, I've already provisioned an Azure Synapse workspace. So what is Azure Synapse? Azure Synapse, if you've noticed from this 3-hour presentation, anytime I wanted to go look at my storage account or my database or my server or create a pipeline in Data Factory or go, if we wanted to build Power BI reports, we have to go to all these different windows. We have to go over here, and it's easy to get lost in the navigation experience. Really, really easy. So what is Azure Synapse? Azure Synapse is what Microsoft is called a unified analytical platform, where I can build my Power BI reports, I can interact with my data lakes, I can build all of my Data Factory pipelines, I can build notebooks for my Apache Spark. You can do all of that in a central location without ever leaving that screen. So it just makes your overall experience a lot better. Your data analysts, your data engineers, your data scientists, they're all going to be able to use the same workspace, and you're kind of working in that same environment without having to go to all these different tabs. And so Microsoft is going to continue to grow on top of this. And so what we've done today with Data Lake, as well as with our Data Factory pipelines, we can do everything that we've done in all these different windows. We can actually do that right there in Azure Synapse. Now, there's a lot more to Azure Synapse, but this is me giving you a quick introduction to it. At Pragmatic Works, we do a lot of analytics in a day events for Microsoft. which is a full day event for Azure Synapse Analytics. And so we do a full day where you have a demo environment and you can explore it. And so take a look at Microsoft, take a look at those analytic in a day events, and maybe go join one of those if you're really interested in this. But I'm going to give you a quick introduction. So I'm going to click on that workspace that I've previously provisioned. Just like Data Factory, once you open up Azure Synapse, you're then going to click on Open Up Synapse Studio. So right here in the middle of the screen, it's a little hidden. It used to be up across the top when it was in preview. You could go open Synapse Studio here, but it's not there anymore. We're going to click down here at the bottom and click Open, and that opens up a new tab, right? Just like Data Factory. In fact, you're going to notice that this experience looks very much like Data Factory did. So we're going to let Azure Synapse run, and we're going to let this load up. And so we should see it. Here we go. All right, so this is the introductory screen. This is kind of like the home page here. Let's talk a little bit about what you see and what you get with Azure Synapse. We'll do some quick introduction to different pieces here. If we come over to the left, you see this navigation pane. This looks very similar to Data Factory, right? You have that collapsible pane. And inside of that, notice that we have Monitor and Manage, exactly like Data Factory. We have Integrate for building pipelines, exactly like Data Factory. But there's a couple of other tabs here as well. And so what I've done in this Azure Synapse Studio is I've already built a couple of items that we can take a look at. But first of all, let's go over to Data. Under the Data tab, this is where I can link my different resources. And so you'll notice right now I have two different Azure Data Lake accounts linked to this Azure Synapse environment. Two. And I could link more, right? I could come up to the top here and I could say, you know what? I want to link to some additional, I could add additional data lakes here. And so that's one thing you can do. You'll also notice, interestingly enough, in the data section, you can create data sets. Now, these data sets are for use in Data Factory pipelines. So this is where you would do it if you wanted to do this in Synapse. And see that I've created a Azure Data Lake. So that's the great thing about naming this. That's an Azure Data Lake. So this is my product file. And this is my SQL table for the products. So we have the two data sets already created right there. If I go over to Develop, actually, let's go back to Data. Here's another really awesome thing about Azure Synapse. You can actually run queries on demand against files that are sitting in your data lake. So you can do that data exploration and understand what are those files, what's in those files. So for example, let's see what we have in these data lakes right here. If I go over to my products, hopefully I have something in this one. There we go. We got one file in this file right here. So I'm going to go into the data lake, go into that container, and you'll notice I have a product list.csv file. If I right click on it and I say new SQL script, I can actually write a SQL script against that file and just get a quick idea of what's in that file without having to leave, without having to go over to some other tab like Azure Explorer or some other window in Azure. So I can run a top 1,000 rows, and then I can tell it to run it, and I'm running it against a built-in SQL on-demand instance. So in Synapse, you will get charged for that instance, those virtual machines or whatever they are that run in the background that give you the compute, the CPU, the memory, the resources to run this. But here it is. I can now see that file live and in action right here inside of Azure Synapse, right? And so that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. You can also do other stuff. Let me go up to the very top here. It created a SQL script. If I wanted to save the script, I could. But I'm going to go ahead and close that script down by clicking on the X button right there, close and discard those changes. And then I could also right click on that product list and I could do something like a new notebook, right? So if you want to create an Apache Spark notebook directly from that file that's sitting right there, I can just tell it, you know what, let's just go ahead and create a new notebook and load that to a data frame so I can start working with that file. Whether it's writing Python or C# or Spark SQL or Scala, those different languages, you can create a notebook right here. You can also create a new Spark table. You can also create a data flow. And this is, yes, the same data flow that we were just looking at in Data Factory. It's the same type of data flow that does the same thing. So we can create a new data flow using this essentially as a data source. So this is really cool. You can also just say, hey, you know what? I want to create a data set for my Data Factory pipeline. Instead of going through all that work, you can just right click right here and that file becomes a data set that you can, of course, modify after the fact. So this is really awesome functionality that just lives here and exists for those files that are in my data lake. Now, that was the data lake section. Here's a couple of data sets I've already created. We'll come back to that. Under Develop, this is where you will store all of your SQL scripts that you want to save in your Synapse Studio, all of your notebooks that are running your Apache Spark jobs, your data flows that you're using for your Data Factory pipelines that you're using in Data Factory. your Spark job definitions, and then you can also do something in here called Browse Gallery. Browse Gallery takes you out to really a bunch of different templates that are available. Templates that are available for SQL scripts, notebooks, data flows, and so you can leverage those templates, which I always find to be a great thing, right? Templates are always great because they give you an idea of what other people have done, and you can either reuse it or you can break that down and dissect it and then do some stuff yourself. So that right there is where you can go if you want to browse galleries, and you would do that by just clicking right here on that plus icon from the Develop tab. Now we're not going to do anything with the Develop tab today, but that's where it is. By the way, this is something that wasn't in preview but is there now. You can also set up your code repository for Azure Synapse, and so you can save all the work and code that you do directly to your code repository, whether that's in GitHub or Azure DevOps as well. And then over here under Integrate, we can build all of our pipelines, once again, just exactly like we did in Data Factory. Then we have monitoring, where we can look at all of our pipeline runs, all of our scheduled jobs that have run, all of our run times to see how their performance has been and their resource utilization. And so all of that cool stuff shows up right here under monitoring. We didn't get into that today, but the monitoring is very easy to understand and it's very robust. Very good job by Microsoft there. And then we go over to Manage. Now Manage is very familiar to us. It's the same Manage tab that we had in Data Factory, but it's got a couple other options because we're in Azure Synapse. And so hopefully what you're seeing as we go through this, and I'll run a data flow here or a Data Factory pipeline in just a moment, but hopefully what you're seeing and what you're deriving from this is that Microsoft is trying to give you a lot of the functionality that already exists in Azure. They're trying to give it to you in a central location, a unified development experience so that you don't have to do what we've done for the last 2.5 hours, which is go back to Azure, click on this link, open a new tab, go back to Azure, go back to your resource group, open a new tab. Now I can come into this Synapse workspace and I have all of these different hubs, the Home Hub, the Data Hub, the Develop Hub on the left-hand side. And if I want to build a pipeline, I go here. If I want to look at my data lakes, I go to the Data Hub. If I want to develop some SQL scripts and do some notebooks, I go to the Develop Hub, right? We can go to these different hubs in here and we don't have to go all over the place to do that. You can also build your Power BI in here. Now I'm on a sponsored Microsoft account, so I'm not logged in under my Pragmatic Works account, so I can't quickly get in and do that. But if I'm under Manage here and I go over here and go to my linked services, right here, you'll notice I've already created about a couple of linked services in preparation for this event. And if I go over here and click New, you'll notice across the top it says, hey, you can connect to Power BI. And so I can connect to Power BI with my Pragmatic Works account if I were in my Pragmatic Works subscription. And then I can connect to a workspace and I can build Power BI reports right here in Azure Synapse workspace. Now, once again, there's more to Synapse, obviously, than what I'm talking about in a 15-minute kind of run-through demo here at the end. But this ties back into everything we've done today. And then there's additional capabilities on top of this. This is really cool. This is really exciting. And this is a big thing from Microsoft that was released just this month in December. I think it was December. Maybe it was at the end of last month. I think it was this month, though. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to show you how to run a pipeline real quick. I'm going to show you the work that I've done, run a pipeline, and then if there's any common questions that I need to answer, we'll answer them. If not, we will wrap up this event. So over here on the left, under Manage, what I've done is I came in here and clicked on New, and I created two connection managers primarily. One to my Azure Data Lake, learning with the nerd events, and then one to my SQL database, right? So those are the two link services I created. So if you remember back to Data Factory, I went through the same process. I created those two link services, and then I did that. So I've got the two link services there. Now, I see a question from Brian here, so I'll take a look at that here in just a moment once our pipeline runs. And then we have a couple of data sets. Data sets are doing the exact same thing they did in Data Factory. I click on the ellipsis right here, I tell it new integration data set, and I go through the same process that we did in Data Factory. So the experience is identical, right? And I create those data sets. Now, we've created our connection managers, we've created our data sets. Now we go over to Integrate, and under that Integrate hub, we are going to come into our pipelines and we're going to create a new pipeline. So let's see, Ricardo said, can you execute ML here? So what you can do here through ML is going to be through the Develop tab, and through Develop you can create your notebooks, and you can, I think that you don't have R right now as a primary language, but you have Python. So any of the libraries that are out there, you can install those libraries and you can run any of that code through that. And then the other question we have is, can I connect to Azure Synapse and Azure Data Factory to an on-prem GitHub repo. I don't know about that. I have not tried to connect to on-prem GitHub. I've always, actually I don't even use GitHub. I've only done it for a couple simple examples. I always use Azure DevOps, so unfortunately I'm the wrong guy to ask for the on-prem version of the GitHub repository. I know you can do it with the cloud. I've done it with that. I'm not quite sure about on-prem, so I apologize for that one. But yes, so let's go ahead and create a new pipeline real quick. And then you'll notice I've already got one that will run here in just a moment. But when I create that new pipeline right here, I can come over here and say, hey, I want to create a copy activity, connect to my data sets, and we're done. Now, this one right here is already doing all the work. But let's just change something real quick. So I'm going to go back over to data. We'll go into our Azure Data Lake product. And I'm going to give this a new one. I'm going to call this live event, right? So this is our live one that's going to get created right now when I run this pipeline in just a moment. So we've given it a new name. I'm going to come back over to my pipeline and I am going to, let's run this existing pipeline. We'll get rid of this one I just created a second ago. Delete pipeline 1, yes. And then we're going to run this pipeline in debug mode right here. Let's give it a moment. This should run pretty quick. Now here's the beautiful thing about Azure Synapse. I don't have to go back to Azure Storage Explorer. I don't have to go back over to the Azure portal and find my Azure Storage Data Lake account. Instead, what we can do is we're going to check our storage account right here in this unified development experience, right? And so you see that it ran successfully. If we take a look at the screen here, we see it ran successfully. It took about 5 seconds there. And now how do we verify that it worked? Well, we go back over to data, right? We go back over to data. We go back over to our Data Lake account. And so I'll click on my products here, and then I'm going to refresh this. And I'm assuming that I have the right account hooked up and connected here. So let's find the refresh button here. Refresh, and there we go. So now, whoops, it's not break time. Now we have that new file right there. It is a live product list. We just created it. And so the great thing about Azure Synapse, forget about all the other improvements that are coming out that they've made, is that all of these different things that we used to have jump between all these different screens, we can now do it all in one place, one location, and Microsoft will continue growing on this experience, which will be a really beautiful thing, really beautiful thing. All right, are you charged for the pieces or are you charged for the complete package? If you're talking about Azure Synapse, they're all billed separately. So they're billed the same way that they are back in Azure. So for example, a data factory pipeline execution, you're charged for the data integration units for that run, the total integration units used. And so even here, it's still broken out, and on your bill, it is a separate line item for data factory integration units. And your Azure Storage account, your Data Lake account, you have a separate line item there for any egress charges moving on between different regions, and you have your separate line items for writing data and reading data. So you are absolutely billed and charged for the different pieces individually. And that's because that's the way they're set up. So Microsoft can't really undo all that and bring it together here. So great question. So that wraps up everything we covered today. I'm going to, real quick here, put my contact information on the screen. Once again, that is in those class files for you as well. And then if there are any questions, Brian, that are pretty common questions that we've seen over and over again, let me know. We'll see if we can do our best to answer them. Anything we can't answer, what we'll do is we'll try to answer them in a follow-up blog in the next week or so. We'll try to get it out pretty quick, but I know my schedule. I came off a 10-day vacation, and so I am catching up on a lot of things here, and I have a lot of stuff coming up in the next week or two, but I'll try to get that done for you guys, where we just do a question and answer kind of blog and answer a lot of the ones we couldn't get to today, because I know the chat has been blowing up throughout the entirety of this presentation. And Azure is huge. It's a huge platform, hundreds of services. How does this affect me, my job, my company? All of those things are going to be things that we talk about. Can you do auto scaling? So you can for some services, right? So it depends on the services that you're using. You can do auto scaling. There is capability in there. For example, with Azure Databricks. In Azure Databricks, you can set it up so that you say, all right, minimum compute nodes is 2, maximum workers is 8, and it will automatically scale as necessary. So if you're not doing anything, it sits at 2, and it scales up to 8 when necessary. And so can you do auto scaling in Azure? Absolutely, but it depends on the service. Different services offer different capabilities for that. Yep, great question. Sam said, are these batch processes and do we schedule them somewhere? Great question. Let me jump back over there real quick for you. So the way you would schedule these processes and they are done in a batch, right? But the way that you would schedule them, especially for Azure Data Factory, is under Manage, and you can do this back in Data Factory or in Azure Synapse. In fact, let me just do this in Data Factory because Synapse might be a little bit different there, and I want to make sure in the 1 minute that we have I can get this done. Under Manage here, I can go down to Triggers, and I can create what's called a trigger, which is a schedule, right? And when I click New, it'll open up a window over here, and I'll say, Daily Schedule. And then I'll tell it we want to run this on a schedule, give it a start date, and then you tell it how often you want it to occur. So I want this to occur every day, and so it's going to run every day, and then I tell it what hour. So I'm going to say I want this to run every day at 7 a.m. All right? And then no ending date. So now I'm done. I've created a trigger. You saw how easy that was. Super easy, super simple. So that right there is going to be step 1. Step 1, create your scheduled job. Step 2, you now have to actually go back to the pipeline and attach that pipeline to that schedule. So I would go back over to the Author tab here, and I would find a pipeline like the copy product list, and then across the top right here, I would tell it essentially that I want to add it to a trigger. So I would click right there, and I would say New or Edit, and I would click right there. So first you create the schedule, then you come back to the pipeline, and you go into Add Trigger, and then I just choose the schedule I want to add it to. And it gives you all the properties again if you want to change them. I don't want to change the original schedule. So I click OK, and I click OK. And that's it. So now you'll see up here it's highlighted in the screen. It's highlighted, it's part of a schedule. So that will now run every day at 7 a.m. as part of the schedule. And so yeah, that is how you schedule them for Azure Data Factory. Great question. Thank you, Sam, for that. All right. All right, that's going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for all your questions. Thank you for attending this event by Pragmatic Works. We love doing these events. They're always fun. We love giving back to the community. So let us know what you thought. Remember, we have an event coming up here in just 2 months with Brian Knight, where we're going to be doing Power Apps, and that's a 3-hour event, and I don't know if there's anything cooler than Power Apps. So make sure you sign up for that. And until next day, or next time, enjoy.